The entire precinct erupted in laughter. A nurse sitting in a plastic chair, still in scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic, had a tattoo that proved everything. Detective Ryan Caldwell held up his phone, showed the photo to the room, and said, loud enough for her to hear through the glass, "Looks like Harbor Ridge hired themselves a criminal." The laughter didn't stop. Emily Carter sat completely still, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on a water stain on the floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She just waited. Nobody in that room knew they were laughing at the most dangerous person there. This story already has you. Follow along to the end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city or country where you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Emily Carter was 3 hours into a 12-hour shift when the radio traffic started bleeding through the trauma bay. She caught fragments officer down, highway interchange, possible multi-vehicle, and tuned it out the way she'd trained herself to, because the ER didn't care what was happening outside. The ER only cared about who walked through its doors. 2 officers walked through 20 minutes later. Not critical bruised ribs, one with a laceration above the eye that had bled through 2 field dressings. They were loud about it, the way people who are scared and trying not to show it always are. One kept repeating that the other guy got it worse. The other guy said he was fine, then winced hard when Emily pressed 2 fingers below his rib cage to check for guarding. "Hurt," he said. "It's supposed to," she said. Not unkind. Just honest. She worked through both of them efficiently. Cleaned the laceration, confirmed no pneumothorax, ordered a chest film on the second officer because his oxygen sat was dipping in a way that was almost subtle enough to miss. Almost, she caught it. She caught everything. That was just what Emily Carter did. What she didn't do was talk much. She answered questions when they were useful, explained procedures when patients needed to understand what was happening to them, and went quiet the rest of the time. Some nurses chatted through procedures to keep patients calm. Emily believed competence was more calming than conversation. In 5 years at Harbor Ridge Medical Center, she had never once been wrong about that. She was taping a clean dressing over the laceration when the officer with the chest film, Kalowski, according to his badge, looked at her wrist. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She always did during procedures. The tattoo was visible, a rose, deep red, vinework curling toward her inner forearm, covering a section of her wrist where the skin texture shifted in a way the ink mostly concealed. Kalowski stared at it for about 3 seconds too long. "That's quite a tattoo," he said. "Thanks, Emily," she said. Pulled her sleeve down. "Looks like a cover-up." "It is," she said. "That's what cover-ups are for." She didn't say it with any particular edge. It was just true. Stared at her a moment longer, something calculating moving behind his eyes. She didn't give him anything else. The chest film came back clean. Small pulmonary contusion, nothing surgical. She sent both officers out with discharge papers and a note recommending follow-up in 48 hours, and she moved on to the next bay without looking back. She didn't think about the way Kalowski had looked at her wrist again until the detective showed up at the nurse's station at 6 in the morning. His name was Ryan Caldwell. He wasn't wearing a uniform plainclothes, sport coat, the kind that fit like he'd bought it 2 years ago, and hadn't noticed it had stopped fitting right. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, hair going gray at the temples, with the particular confidence of a man who had been right about people just often enough to stop questioning whether he might sometimes be wrong. He asked to speak with the nurse who'd treated officers Kalowski and Garza. The desk coordinator pointed at Emily without asking why he wanted her. Emily was charting. She saw him coming the way she always saw things coming, peripheral, early, with enough time to assess before making eye contact. "Emily Carter," he said. "Yes. Detective Ryan Caldwell, Harbor Ridge PD. You treated 2 of my officers last night." "I did." "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" She saved her chart entry and turned her chair to face him fully. "About what?" "Routine follow-up. The accident they were involved in is part of an active investigation." He paused. "Let that sit for a moment. Also, one of the officers mentioned something about a tattoo." Emily kept her expression completely neutral. "Okay. Can I see it?" She looked at him for a long beat. He was watching her with a specific kind of attentiveness that wasn't actually curiosity, it was surveillance. He'd already decided something. He just wanted confirmation. Pulled up her sleeve. He looked at the tattoo. Took out his phone. Photographed it not with her permission. Not even really asking. Did it like it was automatic. "Where'd you get that?" he said. "A shop in Ridgecrest," she said. "About 6 years ago." "What's it covering?" "From what?" "An accident." "What kind of accident?" "The kind that left scars," she said. He looked up from his phone. Something shifted in his face, not anger exactly, but the specific irritation of a man who expected cooperation and wasn't getting it. Miss Carter, I'm trying to have a conversation here. You're photographing my wrist without asking and calling it a conversation, she said. I answered your questions. Is there something specific you need for your investigation, or are you here about the tattoo? He held her gaze, then he put his phone away. We may need to follow up, he said. I know where the precinct is, she said, and turned back to her chart. She should have known it wouldn't end there. She'd known it wouldn't end there. She just hadn't expected how fast it would move. By noon, she heard through the particular efficient gossip network that ran through every hospital she'd ever worked in that Caldwell had gone to Harbor Ridge's administrative offices. By 2, her charge nurse, a solid and generally fair woman named Patricia Reese, came to find her with an expression Emily recognized as professional apology. Administration wants to have a conversation, Patricia said. About what? The police are asking questions about your background. Emily set down the IV bag she was hanging. What kind of questions? I think you should come hear it from them directly. The meeting was in a conference room on the 4th floor. Present, the hospital's chief nursing officer, a man named Garrett Falk, who Emily had always found to be competent but conflict-averse, the head of HR, and Detective Caldwell, who had apparently been invited and had apparently not thought that was unusual. Emily sat down. She didn't bring anything with her, no file, no notes, no defensive preparation. She just sat. Falk opened by saying they had concerns about a police inquiry and wanted to address them proactively, which was administrator language for we are scared of liability and you are the liability. Caldwell took that as an invitation. He pulled up something on his laptop. She couldn't see it from across the table and said, Miss Carter, we're looking into some gaps in your employment history. Prior to Harbor Ridge, you worked at a clinic in Danner County for about 8 months. Before that, we're having trouble locating records. Then you're not looking in the right place, she said. Can you tell us where we should look? I'd suggest starting with my references. I submitted 3 of them when I was hired. We've reached out to 2 of them. One number is disconnected. One gave a reference, but was vague about the specifics of your work. People give vague references when they've been asked to, she said. The HR director, a small nervous woman named Beckett, shifted in her seat. Caldwell looked at Emily steadily. That's an interesting thing to say. It's a true thing to say. I'm not going to explain to you why my references give vague references when I have no idea what conversations you've had with them, or what you asked. Tattoo, Caldwell said. What about it? The pattern, specifically the underlying scarring, is consistent with imagery associated with certain criminal organizations that operate in the minus. It is not true, Emily said. Her voice didn't change. The temperature of it didn't change, but something in her posture shifted infinitely small, the way a structure adjusts to load without visibly moving. You're describing a rose tattoo over healed scar tissue on a woman's wrist, and you're reaching for a connection that doesn't exist. I suggest you be very careful about what you put in writing. Caldwell leaned back slightly. Falk was looking at the table. We're not accusing you of anything, Beckett said quickly. Then I'm not sure what we're doing in this room, Emily said. We're asking for your cooperation, Caldwell said. Provide documentation for the gaps in your employment history. Explain the references. We'll close this out quickly. The gaps in my employment history are not something I'm willing to discuss in this context, Emily said. If you have a specific legal basis for requesting that information, I'll speak with an attorney and respond appropriately. If you don't, I'm going to ask that this meeting end and that I be allowed to return to my patients. Stood up. Miss Carter, Falk said. The apologetic expression was worse now, pained, conflicted, the look of someone who already knew they were about to do something they'd feel bad about. We may need to temporarily reassign you from the trauma unit while this is sorted out. Emily looked at him. Precautionary, he said. Just until we have clarity. You're removing me from the trauma unit because a detective showed up with a photograph of my wrist, she said. That's what's happening, she said. I just want to make sure we're naming it correctly. Falk had nothing to say to that. Emily picked up her badge from the table where she'd set it and walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. How long do you need, she said. A week, maybe 2. She nodded once and walked out. She drove home in daylight, which always felt wrong after a night shift. The city looked different in morning light flatter, more ordinary. She lived in a second-floor apartment in a building called the Brennan Arms, which had a name that suggested something grander than it was. 2 rooms efficient, easy to leave. She'd furnished it in the way of someone who hadn't fully decided to stay. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, looked at her wrist. The rose was well done. The artist in Ridgecrest had been good, better than she'd expected. It It sat over the scarring the way a new wall sits over old damage. You knew what was underneath, but you didn't have to see it. Scars themselves were surgical, not self-inflicted. People's always assumed, and she'd stopped correcting them, because the truth was more complicated than any correction she could offer in the moment. She drank her coffee. She didn't call anyone. She didn't have many people to call, and the ones she did have were complicated in ways she wasn't ready to navigate. She slept for 5 hours, woke up, and checked her phone. There was a text from Patricia Reese. "I'm sorry. I hope you know I fought it." There was a voicemail from an unknown number. She almost didn't listen to it. She'd gotten unknown numbers before, and they were never anything good. But something made her press play. The voice was male, professional, carefully uninflected, Ms. Carter. "My name is Special Agent Devin Marsh. I'm with the FBI's Emergency Operations Coordination Division. I understand you may have had some difficulty with local law enforcement today. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Please don't respond to any further questions from the Harbor Ridge PD until we've had a chance to talk." A number followed, a 202 area code. Emily listened to the message twice. Then she set her phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She didn't call back immediately. She knew enough about how these things worked to know that calling back immediately was a choice that communicated things she hadn't decided to communicate yet. Instead, she went for a run. It was mid-afternoon when her phone started going off with emergency alerts. She was back from her run, standing in her kitchen with a glass of water, when the alerts came through 3 in quick succession, the kind of cascade that meant something had gone seriously wrong. Multi-vehicle collapse, I-74 interchange at Harbor Junction. Mass casualty event, all emergency services requested. Stood in her kitchen for about 30 seconds. Then she went to get dressed. She could see the smoke from 6 blocks away. The I-74 interchange had been undergoing structural assessment. For 2 years she knew this the way anyone who drove it regularly knew it, which was to say she knew it the way she knew other uncomfortable facts she couldn't do much about. The central overpass had failed. It had failed catastrophically, and it had taken a section of road with it, and there were vehicles, she counted at least 12 from the approach, collapsed at angles that made her chest tighten in a specific, operational way. There was already a perimeter. Already fire trucks, already officers trying to manage the crowd gathering along the outer edge. She could hear the helicopters before she saw them. She had her hospital badge. She had the trauma bag she kept in her car, because she'd always kept a trauma bag in her car, which was something she didn't explain to people because the explanation was complicated. She badged her way through the outer perimeter with confidence that assumed she was supposed to be there, and an officer who was too overwhelmed to make a different call let her through. The scene was exactly what she'd expected and worse. Tridge had been attempted and then essentially abandoned in the face of volume. She could see that immediately the colored tags were distributed inconsistently. 2 of the red-tagged patients were not in positions that would give them a survivable chance. And there was a woman in a vehicle 30 feet to her left who was untagged and almost certainly in respiratory distress. Emily moved. She got to the untagged woman first. Impacted against the steering wheel, conscious but confused, breath sounds uneven. Emily pressed her fingers to the woman's neck, her side, found the deviation. Simple pneumothorax. Not simple in the field, but manageable if you had the right equipment and the right hands. Called over the nearest firefighter. "I need a chest seal and I need it fast." "Do your medics have— Who are you?" the firefighter said. "I'm a trauma nurse, and this woman is going to stop breathing in the next few minutes." "Where are your medics?" He pointed. She went. The medic she found was young and visibly in over her head, not incompetent, just overwhelmed in the way that overwhelm happened when the scene was larger than any training scenario you'd been put through. Emily introduced herself in about 8 words, assessed what the medic had in her kit, and started talking her through the stabilization with the specific efficiency of someone who had done exactly this before, in worse conditions, with fewer resources. "You do this a lot?" the medic said while they worked. "Sometimes," Emily said. That was the first 20 minutes. She lost track of time after that in the way that only happened in mass casualty events. Time compressed and stretched simultaneously, each patient a universe, and also just one task, in a sequence that didn't have an obvious end. She moved through the scene with a systematic logic, triaging what hadn't been triaged, correcting what had been tagged incorrectly, directing the medical personnel who were there to the patients who needed them most. A fire captain found her somewhere around the 40-minute mark. His name was Doss. She saw it on his jacket. He was a solid man, mid-50s, the kind of face that had been tested by things and hadn't cracked under them. He was watching her with a look she'd seen before and always found tiresome. The look of a competent person trying to recalibrate. "Who put you in charge?" he said. "Nobody," she said. She was splinting a forearm without looking up. "If someone else wants to coordinate medical, they should step up. We have a medical coordinator on the way." "How far out?" "Checked. 20 minutes. Then we'll lose 2 of the patients in Bay 3, and 1 of the officers pinned in the commercial vehicle before they get here," she said. "Or we don't if we do what I'm telling you to do." "Call, Captain." He looked at her for 3 seconds. "Then what do you need?" 3 more medics on the left flank. 2 unconscious patients by the truck haven't been properly assessed. And someone needs to tell your people that the green-tagged man in the gray sedan is not green, he's crashing, and nobody's touched him in 20 minutes. Doss turned and started issuing orders. She moved on. It was during the second hour that she heard someone behind her say her name, not the way the emergency personnel had been saying it as a functional address, but in a different register entirely. Careful. Deliberate. She turned. Detective Caldwell was standing 10 feet away, looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read. He'd been on scene. She'd noticed him peripherally twice, at the outer perimeter, doing what detectives did at accident scenes. He hadn't approached her. Now he was approaching her, and something in his face was different from the morning. The certainty had gone somewhere. "You've been running triage for over an hour," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite not one. "Yes," she said. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Medical training," she said. That's more than nursing school." She looked at him. She was tired and the scene wasn't over, and she genuinely didn't have time for this conversation. "Detective, I have 4 critical patients who need attention before the medical coordinator arrives. Whatever you want to say to me, it's going to have to wait. Emily." A different voice. She went still. She knew that voice. Turned, and the man walking toward her across the debris-scattered road was wearing civilian clothes jeans, a dark jacket, but had his badge out. FBI. The 202 area code in her voicemail made sense now. "Come here." He hadn't waited. Special Agent Devin Marsh was about 40, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be very calm in very loud situations. He looked at her with the recognition of someone who knew exactly who she was, and the expression on his face was not surprise. "I've been trying to reach you," he said. "I know," she said. "I was busy." Marsh glanced around the scene, took it in the rapid, comprehensive way of someone assessing a situation in the field. Then he looked back at her, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Can see that," he said. Caldwell had stopped several feet away. He was watching this exchange with an expression that was becoming progressively harder to maintain its confidence. "Agent Marsh," he said. "Harbor Ridge PD. You're here about the accident?" "I'm here about Miss Carter," Marsh said. He said it without looking at Caldwell. He was still looking at Emily. "We had some concerns when we saw the inquiry your department submitted this morning." "What inquiry?" Caldwell said. "The one requesting her federal employment records." Marsh finally looked at Caldwell. "You didn't submit that through official channels, which is why it came to us as a flag instead of a request. We take flags seriously." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Conducting a legitimate investigation." "Into what?" Marsh said. It was a simple question, delivered without aggression, and somehow that made it worse. "Ground inquiries. She has gaps in her history." Her tattoo pattern, Marsh said, "suggests possible affiliation with detective." Marsh's voice was still even. "I know what that tattoo is. I know exactly what that tattoo is." He paused. "I was at the debrief when she got it." Silence. The scene noise continued around them, voices, radio traffic, the distant sound of hydraulics where firefighters were still working extraction. The 3 of them stood in a pocket of quiet that was starting to feel like a verdict. Caldwell looked at Emily. The certainty that had been in his face that morning, the particular confidence of a man who had made up his mind about someone, was fracturing in real time. She watched it happen without any particular satisfaction. She was too tired for satisfaction. "I need to check on Bay 3, she said, to no one in particular, and walked away from both of them. She had patience to keep alive. The other conversation could wait. It had waited this long. She found 2 critical patients in Bay 3, exactly where she'd said they'd be, and she spent the next 30 minutes working alongside a trauma surgeon who'd arrived with the medical coordinator's team, and the surgeon, a sharp woman named Okafor who'd clearly seen a lot, took one look at the fieldwork Emily had done and said without preamble, "You set this up. Triage staging." "Some of it," Emily said. "Who trained you for mass casualty?" Emily glanced up. "I've taken the courses." Okafor gave her a look that said she recognized a non-answer and was choosing to leave it. "Kept working." Between them, they stabilized both critical patients for transport. The second one, a police officer who'd been pinned in his cruiser, gripped Emily's hand when they finally got him on a stretcher. He was young, maybe 25. He had a wedding ring. "You're going to be okay," she told him. "Are you a doctor?" He managed. "Nurse," she said. He seemed to find that unlikely. She didn't explain. The scene was quieting as the sun started to go down, not over, not resolved, but past the acute phase. Distraction was continuing, but the immediate medical crisis had peaked and broken. Emily's was sitting on the back step of a fire truck, which someone had given her permission to do without her asking, when Marsh found her again. He sat down next to her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't call me back," he said. "I told you I was busy. Could have called before you came here." "By the time I saw the alerts, there wasn't time," she said. He nodded. He was looking at the scene. The last light was touching the wreckage in a way that made it look almost peaceful, which was the particular cruelty of light at golden hour. "Caldwell ran your name through the general system," he said. "Got the redacted version, which, if you don't know what you're looking at, can look suspicious." "I know," she said. "He took it to the hospital." "I know that too. They suspended you from the trauma unit." "Reassigned," she said. "Temporarily." "Same thing," Marsh said. She didn't argue. "The same thing." "I need to talk to you about what happens next," he said. She looked at him. The tiredness was settling in now, the real tiredness, the kind that came after the adrenaline finished its work. "How much of it do you have to tell them?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell filed an official harassment complaint this morning before this happened. It's in the system. Once it's in the system, there's a response that has to happen." He paused. "What I can control is what form that response takes." "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. "I know you're not. She stopped, looked at her wrist. The rose was dirt-smudged now from the afternoon's work. Spent a long time making a life where nobody had to know anything. Was good at my job. That should have been enough." "It was enough," Marsh said. "You were enough. What happened today?" He gestured at the scene in front of them. "You know what you did today." "I know what I did," she said quietly. "Doesn't mean I wanted anyone to see it." Marsh said nothing to that. They sat in the fading light and the sound of the scene wrapping down, and somewhere behind them, Emily heard Caldwell's voice on a radio, and she heard the particular quality in it, less certainty. More careful, that meant. A man was beginning to understand that the story he'd told himself about someone was not the story that was true. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired, and she felt the particular dread of knowing that tomorrow someone was going to start asking questions. She'd spent 6 years making sure nobody asked. The agent sitting next to her had answers to all of them. That was the part that frightened her most. The agent sitting next to her had answers to all of them. That was the part that frightened her most. Marsh didn't push it that night. He gave her his card, an actual physical card, which felt almost quaint, and told her to come to the federal building on Aldermore Street the following morning. Not a request, but delivered without the texture of a command. The distinction mattered to her, even if she wasn't entirely sure why. She drove home in the dark. The city had that specific post-disaster quiet, not peaceful, just wrung out. She passed 2 news vans heading toward the interchange. Their satellite dishes extended, like questions pointed at the sky. She kept driving. At home, she stood in the shower until the water went cold, and she watched the dirt run off her hands and thought about the young officer with the wedding ring, and wondered if his wife knew yet that he was alive. She thought about that more than she thought about Marsh or Caldwell. That was either healthy or avoidance, and she was too tired to work out which. She slept without dreaming, which was the best she ever hoped for. The federal building on Aldermore Street was 12 floors of unremarkable glass that had always struck her as trying hard not to be noticed, which was probably the point. She arrived at 8:45, 15 minutes early, because that was the kind of person she was, not punctual for the optics of it, but because arriving anywhere without time to observe the room first made her uncomfortable in a way she'd stopped trying to explain to people. Marsh met her in the lobby. He was in a suit today, which changed the shape of him slightly. He looked like what he was. Yesterday on the scene, in civilian clothes, he'd looked like something else, less institutional, more human. She filed that away without quite knowing why. He signed her in. They took an elevator to the 9th floor. The hallway they walked through was the kind of hallway that told you nothing. No photographs on walls, no directional signage, doors without labels. She'd been in hallways like this before. The room he brought her to was small. Table, 4 chairs, a window that looked at the side of another building. The second agent was already there, a woman, younger than Marsh, with the kind of attentiveness that was either natural or very well trained. Her name was Solis. She shook Emily's hand with a grip that communicated she'd shaken many hands and did not find them interesting. "We're going to talk about what happened yesterday," Marsh said when they sat, "and we're going to talk about Detective Caldwell's complaint. But first I need to ask you something directly." "Okay," Emily said. "How much of your background are you willing to have disclosed?" She looked at him. She'd been thinking about this since last night, turning it like an object in her hands, examining it from every angle, trying to find the version she could live with. "What are the options?" "Option 1, Marsh said. "We disclose enough to close Caldwell's complaint and get you reinstated at the hospital. That means releasing your employment history through federal channels. Classified elements stay classified. Local law enforcement sees a redacted record that explains the gaps without explaining why they're gaps. And the hospital? They'd see a record that confirms your qualifications and your work history. Enough to satisfy HR. Not enough to make it a story," Emily finished. "Correct. What's option 2? Marsh and Solis exchanged a look that lasted about a half second. "Option 2 is a fuller disclosure," Solis said, "particularly relevant given what happened yesterday. Your actions at the scene are going to attract attention regardless. There are already news reports from witnesses describing a nurse who essentially ran the triage operation. Story takes off. I'm trying to prevent the story," Emily said. "We know," Marsh said. He leaned forward slightly. "Emily, I need you to understand something. I know why you walked away. I know what happened in Kaswan province. I know what it cost you." He said the words carefully, like they had weight he was trying not to drop. "But what you did yesterday, there were 12 survivors who would not have survived if you hadn't been there. That's not a metaphor. That's what the medical coordinator said in her report this morning." Emily said nothing. "Caldwell took a photograph of your wrist and called it suspicious," Solis said. "He initiated an inquiry that got you suspended from a trauma unit. What the record shows right now. If we don't correct it, that's the record you keep." "I've had records before," Emily said. "Not like this one," Marsh said. "Caldwell's not backing down. He submitted a secondary report last night after the scene, after he saw what you did, in which he reclassified his initial concerns as ongoing. That means there's now a formal record, suggesting you're under active investigation." Something went cold and exact in Emily's chest. "He submitted that after the scene?" 2 hours after," Solis said. "He watched me work for 2 hours and then submitted a report saying I was under investigation." "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. The coldness in her chest didn't heat up, just clarified. She'd encountered this before, the particular stubbornness of people who had decided something and would rather build more structure around the decision than dismantle it. It wasn't malice exactly. It was the self-protective reflex of a man who couldn't afford to have been wrong. "What does he think he's protecting himself from?" she said. Marsh almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "That's a perceptive question." "The answer?" "Caldwell's been under internal review for the past 4 months, Solis said. "Unrelated matter. His lieutenant has been watching him. The inquiry into you, if it had yielded something, would have been a significant recovery for his reputation." Emily closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "So he went after me because he needed a win." "Think so. And now he's compounding it, because admitting he was wrong would make the internal review worse." "That's our read," Marsh said. She opened her eyes, looked at the window. The side of the other building was a flat expanse of gray concrete, with a single horizontal crack running through it near the top. She focused on the crack. "What happens if I do nothing?" she said. "The investigation stays open," Solis said. "It doesn't go anywhere, because there's nothing to find, but it sits in the system. Caldwell keeps his narrative. The hospital stays cautious about your reinstatement, because they don't want the liability." "And I go find another job," Emily said. "Probably," Marsh said. He didn't soften it. She appreciated that. She looked at the crack in the concrete a moment longer. Then she looked at Marsh. "What exactly was in the report he submitted last night?" Solis slid a document across the table, a single page, most of it redacted, but the unredacted section was enough. She read it twice. Caldwell had described her behavior at the scene as tactically sophisticated, in a manner inconsistent with her stated qualifications. He had noted that her command of personnel and medical resources was irregular for a civilian, with no documented special operations background. He had flagged the FBI agent's presence at the scene as potentially related to the ongoing inquiry. She set the page down. "He's not entirely wrong," she said. "He's not. He's just wrong about what it means." She didn't give him an answer that morning. She told Marsh she needed 24 hours, and he said he could give her 12, and they settled on 18. Which was the kind of negotiation that happened between people who understood how the other person thought. She walked out of the federal building at 10:15 and stood on the sidewalk in the autumn light and called Patricia Reese. Patricia picked up on the second ring. Emily, how bad is it? Emily said. Pause. The pause was its own answer. Falk has been in 3 meetings this morning, Patricia said. Administration is getting calls from the union rep for the PD. Caldwell apparently has friends in the hospital board. Of course he does. There's talk about extending the reassignment indefinitely. Indefinitely. I know, Patricia said. It came out tired and genuine. I'm sorry, I've been pushing back, but you don't have to apologize, Emily said. You're not the one doing it. Is there anything you can tell me? Anything I could take to them that would? Not yet, Emily said. Maybe soon. She hung up, stood on the sidewalk a moment longer. Cab went by. A woman with a stroller passed her, the kid in it asleep with absolute trust. Head lolling, unconcerned. Emily started walking. She went to the hospital anyway. Not to work. She wasn't scheduled, and the reassignment meant she wouldn't have been admitted to the trauma unit regardless. She went because there was something she needed to do, and it required being in the building. The young officer from the scene, the one with the wedding ring, had been transferred to Harbor Ridge during the night. She'd pulled his name from the incident report on the Public Emergency Management website, Garrett Yoon, 26 months out of the academy. She found his room on the 3rd floor. She almost didn't go in. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking through the small window in the door, and saw that his wife was there young, sitting in the chair beside the bed with her hand over his hand, not talking, just present. He was awake. He was looking at her like she was the only stable object in a room that was still spinning. Emily didn't go in. She didn't need to. She just needed to know he was okay, and now she knew. She was turning to leave when the door opened. The wife came out, probably heading to the vending machines or the restroom. She was maybe 23, dark circles under her eyes, wearing the particular expression of someone who had received good news 12 hours ago and was still waiting for the other shoe. Stopped when she saw Emily standing there. Sorry, Emily said automatically. I'm not, I just wanted to check that he was okay. The woman looked at her. Are you the one from the accident? The scene, Emily said. The nurse, the woman said. The one who she stopped. Her eyes went bright and sharp in the way of someone holding something back hard. The paramedic told me. He said there was a nurse who found Garrett before anyone else did. Who told them to cut the roof, that the angle was wrong? Emily said nothing. He has a daughter, the woman said. She's 8 months old. Her voice cracked on the months. Pressed her lips together. I don't know how to say thank you for something like that, Emily said. I want to. I know, Emily said. I'm glad he's okay. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button and stood with her back very straight and her hands still, and she looked at the floor indicator and did not let herself feel anything in particular until she was in the elevator and the doors had closed. Then she leaned against the wall and let out a breath that had been held for longer than she could track. This was why. This was always why. Not the recognition, not the record, not whatever Marsh or Solis or Caldwell thought her motivations were. This, the 8-month-old who still had a father. She straightened up before the doors opened. Called Marsh at 4:30. I want option 1, she said. Minimum disclosure. Close the complaint, reinstate the record, and leave the rest of it alone. Emily, I'm not done, she said. I want option 1, and I want a formal response to Caldwell's secondary report. Not informal, on record. Whatever the FBI's process is for responding to a complaint that was filed in bad faith, I want that process used. Silence on the line for a moment. That's within our authority, Marsh said slowly. I know it is, she said. I also want it documented that Caldwell's inquiry targeted me on the basis of a tattoo and no other substantive evidence. That it resulted in an adverse employment action against a civilian healthcare worker. And that the inquiry was reopened, quote, ongoing, after he observed me performing emergency medical work at a mass casualty scene. Going to create a file on Caldwell. I know what it creates, she said. He already created one on me. I just want to make sure they're in the same system. Another pause. When Marsh spoke, there was something in his voice that might have been respect or might have been relief. It was hard to tell with him. I'll have Solis start the paperwork tonight. Can you come in tomorrow morning? 8:30, she said. We'll be there. She hung up and looked at her wrist. The rose. The dirt was gone now, scrubbed clean. The ink was exactly what it was, color over damage, art over evidence that she'd survived something. Caldwell had looked at it and seen a threat. Most people looked at it and saw decoration. Almost nobody asked the right question, which was, what does a person decide to put there, and why? She'd decided on a rose because of something someone told her once, years ago, in a different life, on a hillside in a country she wasn't supposed to be in. Roses don't grow where nothing hurts, the woman had said, pointing at a wild rose pushing through cracked stone. They need the damage. That's just how they're built. The woman's name had been Nora Vance. She'd been Emily's closest teammate on the FEMA Special Operations Unit for 3 years. She'd been the person Emily was trying to save when everything went wrong in Kaswan province. Emily hadn't been able to save her. She hadn't stopped trying to save everyone else. Paperwork took 2 days. Harbor Ridge's HR received the federal employment verification. On a Thursday afternoon, Emily knew the precise time because Patricia texted her. They just got something from FBI. Falk looks pale. The formal response to Caldwell's complaint came through official channels the following morning. Emily wasn't copied on it because she wasn't a party to the federal communication, but Marsh called her to tell her it had gone through. He's been notified, Marsh said. His lieutenant received a copy. How did he take it? I wasn't in the room, Marsh said. But his lieutenant called us this afternoon with some clarifying questions. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's now much more interested in Caldwell's conduct than he was previously. Emily filed that away. She wasn't satisfied exactly. Satisfaction felt like the wrong word for something this procedural, but there was a correctness to it. Things being documented, things being on record, that mattered. She'd learned, in a longer way than she would have chosen, that it mattered. Falk called her on Friday morning. He sounded like a man who had slept badly for 2 nights and was choosing his words with the specific care of someone who knew that whatever he said was going to be remembered. Told her the reassignment was being reversed. He told her she would be reinstated to the trauma unit effective Monday. He told her the hospital was reviewing the circumstances of the temporary reassignment. Appreciate that, Emily said. Emily, he stopped. Started again. I should have pushed back harder. When Caldwell came in, I should have. You didn't know what you didn't know, she said. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. I'm not interested in relitigating it. I'll be in Monday. She hung up and looked out her kitchen window. The Brennan Arms had a courtyard below that nobody used, much a square of concrete with 2 benches and a tree that had grown at a persistent angle for reasons the building probably should have investigated. She'd looked at that tree dozens of times and never quite decided if its angle was damage or just adaptation. Today she thought it was probably both. She was at the hospital by 7 Monday morning. Patricia Reese met her at the nursing station with the specific warmth of a person who was glad to see someone but was trying not to make it into a thing. She handed Emily a coffee. Emily took it. Welcome back, Patricia said. Thanks for the coffee, Emily said. Don't mention it. Literally. Housekeeping is going to act like we don't have a coffee maker back here. Emily smiled. It came out a little rusty, which was normal. She was better at meaning it than showing it. The shift started without ceremony, which was the best way for things to start. Trauma unit didn't care about what had happened last week. Trauma unit cared about who was in front of it. Emily liked that. She'd always liked that about emergency medicine. It was completely indifferent to narrative. It just needed you to function. She functioned. 3 hours in, she was managing a complex case elderly patient, fall from height, multiple fractures, and a blood pressure pattern that didn't fit the presentation when she heard voices in the hallway. Not urgent voices, just voices with a particular quality to them. She caught the words detective and downstairs and set them aside. 20 minutes later, Patricia came to find her. There's a Detective Vasquez downstairs, Patricia said. She says it's not about a patient. She wants to speak with you when you have a break. Emily didn't look up from her chart. Is Caldwell with her? She came alone. Tell her I'll be down in 30 minutes. The detective waiting in the lobby was not what Emily expected. She was compact, 50s, dark hair with visible gray at the temples, wearing the kind of practical jacket that said she'd stopped caring about whether she looked like television police sometime around her 20th year on the job. She stood when Emily came through the lobby doors, but she didn't put on any performance about it. Miss Carter, she said, I'm Detective Anita Vasquez. Internal Affairs. Emily had been expecting something. She hadn't been expecting internal affairs. She kept her expression even. Detective, I know you've had a rough couple of weeks, Vasquez said. I'm not here to make it rougher. I'm here because we need to talk about Ryan Caldwell. They found an empty family consultation room off the main lobby. Vasquez sat across from her with a small recorder on the table between them. She asked before turning it on. Emily said yes. I've been looking at Caldwell's conduct for the past 4 months, Vasquez said. Not related to you initially. The matter predates you. But your situation has become relevant. He told me he was conducting a legitimate investigation, Emily said. He was conducting an investigation, Vasquez said. Legitimate is a question we're working through. She paused. I've read the federal response to his secondary report, and I've read his initial inquiry. I want to ask you on record to describe what happened in the administrative meeting. Emily described it, flatly, precisely, without editorializing. Date, time. Who was present? What was said? The photograph of her tattoo taken without consent. The immediate suggestion of criminal affiliation. The pressure on hospital administration. Vasquez listened without interrupting, which was the interview style of someone who had learned that silence collected more than questions. And after the accident, Vasquez said, he submitted the secondary report. 2 hours after, Emily said, while you were still on scene. According to the timestamp, Emily said, I didn't know about it until Agent Marsh told me. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. The photograph he took of your tattoo, she said. Did he ever return it? Delete it? Emily thought about that. He didn't mention it. He presented it at a precinct briefing, Vasquez said. Her voice stayed even. The morning after the accident, before the interstate scene had fully cleared. He showed it to a group of officers and described it as I'm reading from notes here, possible gang affiliation marking on hospital employee. This was approximately 12 hours after those same officers had watched you run field triage on their injured colleagues. The room was very quiet. A photograph of my wrist, Emily said. Yes. He showed it to a room full of officers. 14 were present by the log. Vasquez set down her notes. Miss Carter, I'm going to ask you directly. Do you want to file a formal complaint? Emily had been prepared for a lot of things in the last 2 weeks. She hadn't been prepared for the particular quality of that question, not bureaucratic, not procedural. Just direct, do you want? Yes, she said. Vasquez nodded. She'd been waiting for it, like it was the only reasonable answer. I'll need your formal statement. Written, signed, notarized. Can you do that this week? I can do it tomorrow, Emily said. Good. Vasquez reached over and stopped the recorder, tucked it into her pocket. Then she looked at Emily in a way that was different from the interview. Looked just person to person, across a table in a room with beige walls and chairs that didn't quite fit the table. For what it's worth, she said, I've been a detective for 22 years. I've seen a lot of people walk into situations they didn't deserve and walk out smaller than they went in. Emily waited. You didn't, Vasquez said. I don't know much about your background and I'm not going to ask. But I know what you did at that interchange. My nephew was one of the extracted. He works commercial trucking. He was caught in the collapse. She paused. He's got 3 cracked ribs and he went home on Tuesday. Emily said nothing. She didn't know what to say. That's all, Vasquez said. Stood up, extended her hand. Emily shook it. She walked back to the elevator. Pressed the button. She looked at the floor indicator. The doors opened, and standing inside the elevator, looking at her with the expression of a man who had recently discovered that the ground under his certainty was not ground at all, was Ryan Caldwell. He hadn't expected to see her, that much was obvious. He was in civilian clothes off duty or trying to look it. He had the look of someone who'd come to the hospital for a reason he was now reconsidering. The doors stayed open. The elevator waited. Miss Carter, he said. Detective, she said. He looked at her. Something was moving in his face, not remorse exactly. Not yet. Something more like the moment before remorse, when a person is still deciding whether they can afford it. I heard Vasquez was here, he said. Emily looked at him steadily. She didn't confirm or deny it. I know how this looks, he said. I think that might be the first accurate thing you've said about any of this, she said. His jaw tightened, then loosened. The tightening was reflex. The loosening was something else, something that cost him. I was wrong about you, he said. I'm not going to, he stopped. Seemed to weigh something. I'm not going to try to explain it into something better than it was. Good, she said. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. He meant it. She could tell he meant it, which was more complicated than if he hadn't. It would have been easier if he hadn't. That doesn't close the complaint, she said. I know. Internal Affairs is talking to me. The FBI already responded formally. This is in the system now. I know that too. You have to go through that process, she said. Whatever it determines. I know, he said again. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had finally caught up with the consequences of his own momentum, and the catching up had not been easy. For what it's worth, what I saw at the interchange. The work you did. He paused. I've been a cop for 19 years, and I've never seen anyone move through a disaster scene like that. Emily said nothing. I don't know your background, he said. I don't need to, but I know what I saw. The elevator began to signal that it had been held too long. Emily stepped back and let the doors close between them. She stood in the lobby and listened to the elevator ascend. Felt strange. Not victorious. Not settled. Just strange, in the way of someone who has braced against a structure for a long time and has now been told they can stop bracing, and the muscles don't know yet what to do with the information. She took the stairs back up. She was halfway through charting her afternoon patients when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't have saved, but the 202 area code again. Stepped into the supply corridor and answered. It wasn't Marsh. It was a woman's voice, older, precise, with the specific cadence of someone who had run meetings for a very long time and had stopped bothering with preamble. Carter, the voice said. My name is Director Adele Forsyth. I'm the Regional Director for FEMA's Emergency Operations Division. I believe you know Agent Marsh. I do, Emily said. I've been following the situation this week, Forsyth said. Partly because Marsh kept me informed, and partly because 3 separate incident reports from the I-74 scene mentioned you by name. Emily pressed the back of her free hand against the supply shelf. The metal was cold, grounding. Okay, she said. We're rebuilding our Special Operations Field Coordination Team, Forsyth said. We lost staffing during the federal reorganization last year. We're looking for people with your particular combination of medical expertise and field command experience. She paused. I know you chose to step away. I know why. I'm not asking you to undo that choice. I'm asking you to consider whether it's still the choice you'd make. The supply corridor was very quiet. Emily could hear the faint ambient noise of the unit through the door monitors, voices, a wheel on a cart. The sounds of the place she'd been trying to be for 5 years. She'd been trying to be a nurse in a hospital, in a city where nobody knew her name. She'd done it. She'd been good at it. And then a highway had fallen, and 12 people had needed someone who was more than that. I need time to think about it, she said. Of course, Forsyth said. I'm not calling with a deadline. I'm calling because I don't like leaving talent in places smaller than the talent. After Forsyth hung up, Emily stood in the supply corridor for a while. She looked at the shelves, bandages in ordered rows, IV supplies in their labeled bins, the precise and organized evidence of a system that tried to be ready for what came next. She thought about Kaswan Province. She thought about Nora Vance. She thought about the 8-month-old whose father had come home on Tuesday. She thought about the fact that Caldwell had shown a photograph of her wrist to 14 officers, and that one day later, those same officers had watched her keep their colleagues alive in the wreckage of a highway. She thought about what it meant to spend years making yourself small to fit a space that had decided, before it even knew you, that small was all you could be. Pushed off the shelf, walked back to the unit. She had patience to finish charting, and after that she had a statement to write for Vasquez. And after that she had a phone call she wasn't ready to return yet, from a director who had called her talent in a place smaller than the talent. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with any of it. But when she came through the unit doors and Patricia looked up from the station and said, Ewan's wife called the unit. She wanted to leave her name in case you were here. Emily stopped walking for just a moment, and something in her chest that had been held at a specific controlled tension for a very long time shifted slightly towards something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of quiet. Then her pager went off. Trauma incoming. ETA 4 minutes. She moved. She moved. The incoming trauma was a construction worker, late 50s, fallen from scaffolding on the 3rd floor of a building site 6 blocks from the hospital. Paramedics had him on a backboard with a cervical collar and 2 large-bore IVs already running, and they were calling out vitals before the gurney cleared the bay doors. BP 88/60. Heart rate 112, GCS 13 and dropping. Emily was gloved before they finished the handoff. The mechanism was bad. 3-story fall landed partially on his left side, partially on equipment. Paramedic, a heavy-set man named Tully she'd worked with, before gave her the rundown in the clipped shorthand of a field report. No LOC at scene. Deteriorated in transport. Abdomen rigid on palpation. Pelvis unstable. Pelvis unstable was the phrase that narrowed her focus to a point. Get me a second large bore on the right AC, she said, not looking up. And I need a trauma surgeon now, not in 5 minutes. The resident on duty second year, a young man named Patel, who was good under pressure, in the specific way of someone who'd been tested enough times to know he could hold, move to her left, and started the line. The patient's name was Bernard Kowalczyk. She knew that from the paramedic sheet. She used it. Bernard, she said close to his ear. You're at Harbor Ridge. We've got you. Can you tell me where you hurt the most? Everywhere, he said. His voice was wet at the edges. It was the lung. On a scale of 1 to 10, 12, he said. I know that's not 12 works, she said. Stay with me. The next 40 minutes were the kind that compressed time into something non-linear. Trauma surgeon, a compact and humorless man named Dr. Feld, arrived in 7 minutes, which was fast. He took one look at the film the tech had rushed through and said, pelvic ring fracture, with probable retroperitoneal bleed, with the tone of someone confirming what he'd already suspected. And then he and Emily were working in the particular tandem of two people who had done this long enough to communicate, mostly through movement and inference. The bleeding was the problem. It was always the bleeding. They got him stabilized enough for interventional radiology, which was the bridge between the ER and surgery. And Emily walked with the gurney to the elevator and handed off to the IR team with a report that covered everything in under 90 seconds. Feld was already moving toward the surgical suite to prep. She stood in the hallway outside IR for a moment after the doors closed. Her hands were steady. They were always steady during. It was the after that found the shake, sometimes a fine tremor in her right hand, that had started about 2 years after Kaswan province and had never fully resolved. Pressed her palm flat against her thigh and felt it settle. Bernard Kowalczyk had a wife. The paramedics had said she was on her way. He'd said her name in the ambulance, apparently said it repeatedly, the way people did when the ground dropped out from under them and they reached for whatever was most real. Emily went to write her notes before she let herself think about that. Vasquez's statement took 2 hours on Tuesday evening. Emily sat in a conference room at the Internal Affairs Division with a court reporter and Vasquez across the table, and she walked through everything in the precise sequential order that made statements useful rather than emotional. Vasquez asked clarifying questions. The court reporter's fingers moved without pausing. Afterward, Vasquez walked her to the elevator. Caldwell's lieutenant formally requested the internal review be expanded this morning, Vasquez said. She said it the way people delivered information they weren't supposed to editorialize flatly, neutrally, with just enough inflection to communicate that she thought Emily should know. The FBI response accelerated things. How expanded? Emily said. They're looking at 3 other complaints that were previously dismissed. 2 from civilians, 1 from a junior officer in his unit. Vasquez pressed the elevator button. He had a pattern. It was just easier to look past it. Emily thought about that, about how patterns got built not in single dramatic moments but in accumulation, in all the small decisions to look past. What happens to the 3 cases? They get reopened, Vasquez said. Whether they go anywhere depends on the evidence, but they get looked at. The elevator arrived. Emily stepped in. She looked at Vasquez before the doors closed, this compact, practical woman who had 22 years and a nephew with cracked ribs and apparently a very precise sense of what constituted correct. Thank you, Emily said. Don't thank me, Vasquez said. Do the statement. Let the process work. The doors closed. Call from Director Forsyth came again on Wednesday, but this time it wasn't Forsyth herself, it was Marsh, which meant Forsyth had decided to use a gentler approach, which meant she was serious. She doesn't usually call twice, Marsh said. I know, Emily said. She was in her apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee she hadn't touched. What the second call communicates. Are you going to call her back? I haven't decided, Emily. He paused. The pause had something in it, not urgency exactly, but proximity to it. What happened at the interchange? We've had 3 separate AARs reference the field medical coordination as a case study. Coordinator's report specifically flagged the absence of a trained mass casualty specialist as the primary vulnerability in the response. That's a systemic problem, she said. It's not about me specifically. You were there specifically, he said, and 12 people are alive specifically. She looked at her coffee. You're not wrong, she said. That doesn't make the decision easier. What would make it easier? She thought about Nora. She thought about the hillside and the cracked stone and the wild rose. She thought about the specific texture of that moment, the sound, the light, the weight of what she'd been carrying ever since, and she tried to figure out how to say the thing she'd never found words precise enough for. I walked away because I thought I had cost more than I contributed, she finally said. Calculation doesn't just reverse because of one's scene. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said. But the calculation might be wrong. She didn't answer that. They said goodbye, and she sat with the coffee until it was cold. Thursday morning arrived with a problem she hadn't anticipated. She was 40 minutes into her shift when Patricia found her in the medication room with a look that had a specific shape, not emergency, not administrative irritation, but the look of someone delivering news that was going to require management. There's a reporter downstairs, Patricia said. Emily went still. What kind of reporter? Callaway Tribune. She says she's writing a piece on the I-74 response. She's been calling the media relations office for 2 days, and apparently someone in the fire department gave her your name. Which name? Just Emily Carter, Harbor Ridge nurse. Patricia's expression shifted slightly. She doesn't seem to know anything beyond that. But she's persistent. Emily set down the medication she was drawing up. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. Tell media relations no comment. Tell them I'm a private individual, and the hospital doesn't discuss staff with press without consent. They know that, Patricia said. But they want to know if you want to do the interview. No, Emily said, I don't. Okay, Patricia started to turn. Patricia. She waited until the charge nurse looked back. If anyone else gives her my name, my full name, my address, anything beyond what's public record I need to know. Patricia held her gaze. I'll make sure of it, she said. Emily went back to work. The reporter was a problem she could manage. The reporter was a manageable, finite problem, the kind she understood how to contain. What she didn't anticipate was that the reporter was not working alone, and that the person who had given her Emily's name had given a second reporter something more. She found out at 2 in the afternoon when Marsh called her on her break. There's a piece going up, he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, controlled, but working to stay that way. Online, Callaway Tribune-affiliated site. It's vague, it doesn't have your background, but it has your name and it has the tattoo. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. The tattoo. Caldwell's photograph, Marsh said. We don't know how it got out. We're looking, but someone provided it to this reporter, and she's running a piece about the I-74 response that includes your name and a photograph of the tattoo with a caption that asks, I'm reading it, who is the mystery nurse with the marked? Who ran the Harbor Ridge disaster response? She stood in the break room and looked at the vending machine across from her. The vending machine stared back with its grid of snacks, indifferent. Is it up yet, she said. Goes up at 4, Marsh said. We can't stop it first. It's amendment. What we can do. Don't, she said. Emily, don't do anything, she said. Not yet, let me think. She hung up. She sat down in the closest chair, which was hard plastic and slightly lopsided, and she thought, she was good at thinking under pressure. She'd trained herself to be good at it, because the alternative, reacting, without thinking, cost things she couldn't afford to lose. Piece would go up at 4. By tomorrow morning, it would have been shared across the standard social media circuits. Her name attached to a photograph of her wrist, attached to a question about a marked past. Caldwell's framing, laundered through a reporter who probably thought she was doing something worthwhile. Thought about what containment looked like. She thought about what not containment looked like. She thought about all the versions of this she couldn't control. Then she called Marsh back. I want to talk to the reporter, she said. Pause. Emily, not on her terms, she said. I want her contact and I want a conversation before 4 o'clock. If she's going to put my name to a story, I want to be the one who decides which story she tells. The reporter's name was Dana Krell. She was 29, worked the public safety beat, and answered her phone on the first ring in the way of someone who had been waiting for it. Emily asked if she had 30 minutes. Krell said she had 20, which was honest, and Emily appreciated honesty. They met in the lobby of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. Krell was small and quick-looking, with a recording device she put on the table between them before she sat down, because she was the kind of reporter who didn't wait to be asked. Before we start, Emily said. The photograph. Where did you get it? Krell looked at her steadily. I can't reveal a source. I'm not asking for a name. I'm asking whether you understood what it was when you received it. I understood it was a photograph of a nurse's wrist, Krell said, and that it had been flagged in a police inquiry. Taken without my consent, Emily said, by a detective who is currently under formal internal affairs review. It was shown in a briefing to 14 officers without my knowledge. That's the chain of custody on your photograph. Krell was quiet. She hadn't turned on the recorder. The tattoo is a medical cover-up over surgical scars, Emily said. There's nothing else to it. Whatever the police inquiry implied, it was wrong, and it's being addressed through official channels, she paused. I'm not asking you to kill the piece. I'm asking you to understand what you're actually holding. Why did you want to talk to me? Krell said. Because you're going to write something about the I-74 response regardless, Emily said. And I'd rather the thing you write be accurate than be built on a photograph someone handed you to serve their own interests. Krell looked at her for a long moment. She had the eyes of someone who processed quickly and didn't show the processing. What do you want the story to say? I want it to say what's true, Emily said, which is that the emergency response at I-74 had significant coordination gaps, and that those gaps are a systemic problem in how the city prepares for mass casualty events. That's the story. I'm a footnote to the story. You ran the triage for 90 minutes, Krell said. 12 survivors. That's not a footnote. It's an illustration of the systemic problem, Emily said. The fact that a hospital nurse had to step into a coordination role at a mass casualty scene is not a feel-good story. It's an indictment of how underprepared the response infrastructure was. Krell was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and turned on the recorder. Tell me about the gaps, she said. Emily told her. She was precise, specific, non-personal. She talked about triage tagging inconsistencies, about the absence of a dedicated mass casualty coordinator, about the communication breakdown between fire EMS and law enforcement in the first 40 minutes. She talked about it the way she would have written it in an after-action report, structured, evidence-based, without self-congratulation. Krell asked good questions. Emily answered them. The piece that went up at 4:30 was different from the one that had been planned. The headline was, I-74 collapse exposes emergency response gap, survivors say. Emily's name appeared once in the 14th paragraph as a Harbor Ridge trauma nurse who had assisted with field triage. Tattoo photograph did not appear. Dana Krell had pulled it. Emily read the piece on her phone during her dinner break. She sat in the break room with a sandwich she wasn't really tasting and read it twice. Good journalism. Krell had used everything Emily gave her and supplemented it with comments from 2 firefighters and the medical coordinator. Some failures were documented clearly. The framing was not heroic. It was institutional, structural, the kind of story that made administrators uncomfortable rather than readers emotional. It was the right kind of story. She texted Marcia Link. He replied. 4 minutes later, she pulled the photo. Emily wrote back, yes. A pause. Then how? She put her phone away and finished her sandwich. The week moved in the way of weeks that carry too much unevenly, with moments that felt long and transitions that disappeared. Bernard Kowalczyk came out of surgery on Thursday night. Emily didn't hear about it directly, but Tully, the paramedic, texted her because he'd developed the habit of updating her on patients they'd brought in together, and he wrote, scaffolding guy made it. Surgeon said another 20 minutes, and it would have been a different story. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. On Friday, Caldwell's lieutenant, a man named Barrera, called the hospital's chief of staff, which was unusual enough that Falk mentioned it to Patricia, who mentioned it to Emily. Barrera had apparently inquired whether the hospital was aware of the full scope of the internal affairs investigation. The hospital was now aware. Falk had been in 2 additional meetings since. The machinery was moving. It moved slowly, which was its nature, but it was moving. What Emily hadn't anticipated, what she should have anticipated, because she'd been in enough situations to know that pressure doesn't come from one direction at a time, was the letter. It arrived Friday afternoon, hand-delivered to the nursing unit, not to her home address, to the unit, which meant someone had made a specific decision about how to deliver it. Patricia brought it to her with the expression of someone carrying something they didn't know the weight of. Emily's name was on the envelope. No return address. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. She recognized it the way you recognize a voice from another room, not immediately, then all at once. Put it in her locker without opening it. She finished her shift. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table in the same chair she always sat in, with the same angled tree, visible below in the courtyard, and she put the envelope on the table in front of her. She already knew who it was from. She'd known from the handwriting. There were only 2 people who wrote like that, precise, left-leaning, each letter fully formed, and one of them was dead, which meant the letter was from Nora Vance's brother. Thomas Vance had reached out twice before in the 2 years after Kaswan Province. She hadn't responded either time, not because she didn't want to, because she hadn't known what to say to the brother of the person she'd failed to save. There was no language for that. She'd looked for it and found the space where language should have been, and found only silence. She opened the envelope. The letter was 1 page, written on plain paper in that familiar, deliberate hand. Emily, it started. Not Miss Carter, not a formal opening. Just her name. I saw the news piece. I figured out it was you from the description, not the name. Nora always said you were the most competent person in any room you walked into, and that you'd spend your whole life trying not to be noticed. She was right, apparently. I'm not writing to ask anything from you. I know you've been carrying what happened. Nora told me enough for me to understand how much you carry things. I want you to know, and I mean this without any agenda, that I don't blame you. I never blamed you. From what the debrief report said, the parts I was allowed to read, you made every decision correctly. Some things just go wrong. She loved the work you did together, talked about you more than about anyone else on the team. She said you had this ability to be completely calm when everything was on fire, and that it made everyone around you calmer. I don't know what you're doing now, but whatever it is, I hope it's something she would recognize. Thomas Emily read it once. She set it down. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them, the left, which was steady, the right, which had that familiar fine tremor working now, visible even at rest. She had been carrying a verdict she'd issued herself in the immediate aftermath of the worst night of her life, And she had never revisited the verdict. She'd treated it as settled. She'd built an entire architecture of life around it being settled. Some things just go wrong. She picked up her phone. She thought about calling Marsh, who would probably be the right practical person to call. She thought about calling Patricia, who would be the right human person to call. She thought about calling the number Forsyth's office had left. Instead, she sat in her kitchen with her hands on the table and let the quiet of the apartment be what it was: not empty, not lonely. Just the particular quiet of a life that was still being decided. Her phone buzzed. Marsh, a text, not a call. She looked at it. Caldwell's attorney filed a response to the IA review this afternoon, contesting the scope. I'm looking at this now, he's submitted a new affidavit claiming that your actions at the I-74 scene constituted evidence of undisclosed federal employment that you concealed from the hospital. He's trying to reframe this as you being the one who withheld information. Emily stared at the text. She read it twice. The specific quality of the move registered immediately. It was not a defense. It was a reversal. He was turning the investigation around, pointing it back at her, trying to create enough noise that his conduct disappeared inside it. Her phone buzzed again. Marsh, there's more. He's retained a PR firm. Going to be a press statement tomorrow morning. And then a third buzz, the one that made her go very still. Emily, his statement names you specifically. He's going to claim publicly that you used federal connections to suppress a legitimate police inquiry. He's going to use the Krell piece, the one that pulled his photo, as evidence of media manipulation. She set the phone down. The tree in the courtyard below was bent at its persistent angle, holding its shape against the dark. She looked at it for a long moment. Caldwell was not backing down. He was escalating. He was a man who had made a bad decision and doubled it, and was now tripling it because backing down had become somehow, in the architecture of his own self-image, more costly than being wrong in public. She picked up her phone and called Marsh back. He answered immediately. You seeing this? I'm seeing it, she said. What time is the statement? 9 a.m. tomorrow. He's got a presser at the precinct. With who? His attorney, his union rep, and a pause. His lieutenant, Barrera. Barrera, she said. The same Barrera who called Falk this week. Yes. She was very quiet for a moment. Marsh, she said. I need to know something, and I need you to be straight with me. Always, he said. If Caldwell makes this statement tomorrow, if he names me publicly and frames it the way you're describing, what happens to the IA investigation? Marsh took a long breath. It gets complicated. His attorney is good. The union has resources. If he builds a public narrative fast enough, the truth gets lost in the noise, she said. Potentially, Marsh said. These things happen. She pressed her thumbnail against the edge of the table. Hard enough to feel. What would stop it? Count narrative, Marsh said. Faster, louder, and, Emily, I have to be honest, more personal. The minimum disclosure we agreed on. It might not be enough anymore. She didn't say anything. Forsyth has been asking me twice a day for your answer, Marsh said. If you were willing to let her make a statement on FEMA's behalf. Not a small thing, she said. I know. She stopped. The tremor in her right hand was working again. She pressed her palm flat. That's the whole thing, Marsh. That's everything I've been protecting. I know what I'm asking, he said. His voice was careful and genuine. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. But Caldwell's presser is at 9, and if you want to get ahead of it, I'll call you at 7, she said. She hung up. She sat in the quiet apartment with Thomas Vance's letter on the table in front of her, and the phone in her hand, and the tree below bent at its angle in the dark. She thought about Nora. She thought about what Nora would have said. Specifically, in this specific moment, not the idealized version of Nora that memory sometimes produced, but the real one, who swore when she was frustrated and ate terrible food when she was stressed, and had a habit of cutting directly to the thing everyone was avoiding. Nora would have said, stop treating your past like it belongs to you alone. Other people were there. Other people were affected. You don't get to decide for everyone that it stays buried. She would have been right. Emily looked at her phone. 7 hours until she needed to call Marsh. 7 hours to decide whether the life she'd built on silence was worth what the silence was now costing. Picked up Thomas Vance's letter again. Read the last line. I hope it's something she would recognize. Her phone lit up with a new notification, not Marsh this time. An alert from the Harbor Ridge Emergency Management System, which she'd subscribed to after the interchange. Because she subscribed to things now, apparently. She looked at it. The alert was tagged priority, which meant it had bypassed the normal queue. She opened it. She read it twice. It was a preliminary warning from the National Weather Service, relayed through the City Emergency Management Office. Structural assessment of the Harbor Ridge Municipal Water Treatment Facility on the North Shore had flagged critical failure risk in 2 of the primary containment structures. Heavy rainfall over the last 72 hours had exceeded tolerance thresholds. The facility served 400,000 residents in the northern districts. The assessment recommended immediate evacuation planning for a 1-mile radius. Emily looked at the alert timestamp, 11:47 p.m. She looked at the weather outside her window. It was raining. It had been raining for 3 days steadily, without drama, the kind of rain that didn't seem like an emergency until it was. She called Marsh. He picked up before the first ring finished, which meant he'd seen it too. "Tell me you're seeing the water facility alert," she said. "I'm seeing it," he said. His voice was different. The lawyer-careful quality was gone. He was back in field mode, which was where she'd first heard him. "Emily, that facility, if those containment structures fail, 400,000 people," she said. "North District, low-lying residential. Half of them elderly or under 18. The city's emergency management office is being notified. The city's emergency management office isn't staffed for a response this size at midnight," she said. She was already standing, already looking around her apartment for her go-bag. "Who's the on-call coordinator?" Don't let me find out." "Find out fast," she said. "And Marsh?" "Yeah, Caldwell's press conference," she said. "None of that matters right now." "No," he said. "Doesn't. Get me into the Emergency Management Coordination Center," she said. "Whatever credentials you need to pull, I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was already moving toward the door, go-bag over her shoulder, when she heard Marsh say, quietly, and with a precision that felt like something settling into place, "I'll have clearance waiting." She hit the stairwell at a run, and below her the city was dark and wet, and somewhere on the North Shore, 400,000 people were sleeping without knowing what the rain had done to the walls that were supposed to hold. The Emergency Management Coordination Center was in the basement of the Municipal Services Building on Crane Street, a room that had been built during a different era's idea of preparedness, which meant it had too many desks, not enough power outlets, and a communications board that was 3 software generations behind what it was supposed to interface with. Emily had never been inside it. She'd read the city's mass casualty response plan twice after the interchange, because that was the kind of thing she did now, apparently, and the plan referenced this room as the primary coordination hub for events affecting more than 50,000 residents. She walked in at 12:38 a.m. and immediately identified 3 problems. The first was that there were 6 people in the room, and none of them looked like they had been expecting a water infrastructure failure tonight. They had the particular quality of people who had been called in from home, slightly disheveled, coffee that had appeared too fast to have been made here, the low-grade adrenaline of interrupted sleep. The second was that the communications board was showing incoming data from the treatment facility's sensors, and 2 of the readouts were already past threshold, which meant the assessment that had triggered the alert had been conservative. Third was that Marsh was not there yet. A man in his 50s, barrel-chested, wearing a fleece vest over a dress shirt that suggested he'd been at a dinner when the call came, detached himself from a cluster of people near the main board and walked toward her with the look of someone who was going to ask who she was before he decided whether she was useful. "Emily Carter," she said before he got there. "Harbor Ridge Medical. Agent Marsh from FBI Emergency Operations is on his way." "Who's running the coordination?" The man looked at her. "I am Dan Reuter, Deputy Director of City Emergency Management. The North Shore Facility. What's the current read on the secondary containment?" He glanced at the board behind him. "Structural engineers are on site. We're waiting on the sensor data on the board says the secondary containment is at 91% stress load," she said. "What's the failure threshold?" A pause. 85. "Then we're past it," she said. "We're not waiting on an engineer to tell us what the sensors already are. What's the evacuation status for the 1-mile radius?" Rudder straightened slightly. He was not a man who was used to being moved through questions this fast, and she could see him deciding in real time how to respond to it. He chose, to his credit, to answer rather than assert authority. "We've notified PD for traffic management. The alert went to the notification system 20 minutes ago, but residential reach at this hour is poor," she said. "Most people don't have alerts set loud enough to wake them. We need door-to-door in the highest density residential blocks. Who's your PD liaison? Who's on site at the facility right now?" 2 structural engineers, facility manager, and a crew of mine. "Do they have medical support on site?" Reuter stopped. "Medical support. If the containment structures fail, we're talking about a pressure event. Anyone on site is at risk from the failure itself, not just the flooding. Concussive damage, structural debris, Hypothermia from water exposure. She looked at the board again. The engines need to know their extraction window, if those walls go. Who's managing that? Reuter turned and said something to the woman nearest the communications board. The woman started making calls. Marsh walked in at 12:51, and the particular quality of his entrance, unhurried but purposeful, scanning the room before he'd fully crossed the threshold, told her he'd been briefed on the drive over. Came directly to her. What do you have? Secondary containment past threshold. Evacuation notification is inadequate for middle-of-the-night residential reach. No medical support on site at the facility. Reuter is competent but understaffed. She paused. And whoever's managing public communications needs to be very careful about the next 30 minutes, because if it gets to social media before the official notification reaches the affected zones, we'll have a panic evacuation on wet roads at 1 in the morning. Marsh looked at Reuter. She's right on all of it, he said, which was not a sentence that needed any particular delivery to carry weight, but he delivered it calmly anyway. What do you need from us? Reuter, to his credit, put aside whatever his instinct was about jurisdictional authority and said, coordination. I need someone managing the medical side and someone managing communications, because I don't have enough bodies for both. She takes medical, Marsh said. He didn't look at Emily for confirmation. He already knew. The next 4 hours were the kind that produced a specific kind of exhaustion, not physical, though that came too. The exhaustion of sustained decision-making in conditions where every decision had consequences and the consequences arrived before you finished deciding. Emily ran medical coordination from one of the stations on the left side of the room, phone and radio simultaneously, building a triage and reception plan for a potential displacement event that might involve upward of 20,000 residents from the most vulnerable parts of the North Shore zone. 2:15, the structural engineers at the facility called with an update that changed the calculation. The primary containment was showing microfractures in the northeast quadrant. Not catastrophic, not yet, but enough to tell them that the question was no longer if but how fast. Emily put Harbor Ridge Medical on mass casualty standby at 2:22. She called Patricia Reese at home, which she hated doing, and Patricia answered on the third ring and said, "What do you need?" before Emily had finished the sentence explaining why she was calling. Trauma unit on alert for water-related injuries and hypothermia, Emily said. Probably elderly and pediatric heavy, given the residential demographics of the zone. I need you to flag the charge nurses on the overnight and morning shifts. On it, Patricia said. I know, Emily said. Explain later. She called 3 other hospitals in the network and had the same conversation in compressed form with whoever answered it itch. By 2:45, she had a coordinated reception plan that distributed patient load across 4 facilities based on capacity and transport distance, which was the kind of work that looked straightforward on paper and was not. Marsh appeared at her elbow at 3 a.m. He set a coffee on the desk without comment. She drank it without looking up. Evacuation compliance is running at about 60% in the targeted zones, he said. PD has door-to-door running in the highest density blocks. Shelter capacity is holding. The assisted living facility on Marsh Point Road, she said. I flagged it 20 minutes ago. 43 residents, most with mobility limitations. They need specialized transport, not standard buses. I saw your flag. Reuter has 2 accessible vehicles redirected. They need 3, she said. The resident census I pulled from the county health database shows 11 wheelchair users. 2 vehicles won't. I'll get 3, he said. He walked away. She turned back to her screen. This was what it actually looked like. Not cinematic, not elegant. It looked like a woman in a borrowed chair in a room, with bad lighting making phone calls and pulling database records, and catching the things that fell through the gaps, because the gaps were where people got hurt. 3:47 a.m., the primary containment structure at the North Shore facility developed a partial breach. It wasn't the catastrophic failure they'd been preparing for. It was controlled relatively, which meant the damage was real but bounded. A section of the northeast wall gave way, releasing water into the secondary containment basin, which held. The basin held. The structural engineers had gotten the facility crew out with 20 minutes to spare, which was 20 minutes Emily had helped create by flagging the on-site risk 2 hours earlier. The flooding was significant, but contained to the facility grounds and the immediate surrounding area. No residential flooding. No civilian casualties. The people who had evacuated came back to find their neighborhoods intact. People who hadn't evacuated woke up to find they'd slept through an emergency and were, by reasonable luck and a lot of other people's effort, fine. Reuter shook Emily's hand at 5:30 a.m. It was the handshake of a man who had revised his assessments of someone and was acknowledging the revision without making a speech about it. She appreciated that. She drove home in the early light and slept for 3 hours. She was awake by 9, which meant she had missed Caldwell's press conference. She found out about it through Marsh, who texted at 9:43. "You need to see this." Sending a clip. She sat on the edge of her bed and watched 40 seconds of video on her phone. Caldwell was at a podium outside the precinct, his attorney on one side, his union rep on the other. Bereja was notably not there, which she registered before she registered anything, Caldwell said. Caldwell said was that he had conducted a legitimate inquiry into a hospital employee with a suspicious background, that he had been subjected to federal interference in a local police matter, that the media piece by Dana Krell had been the result of coordinated pressure from federal contacts of the subject of his inquiry, and that he intended to file a formal complaint against FBI involvement in what he characterized as a civilian personnel matter. He named her, full name, Harbor Ridge Medical Center. Former federal employee with undisclosed background. He didn't have her federal record that was still protected, but he had enough to frame a narrative, and the narrative was, this woman used powerful connections to make a problem disappear, and I'm the one being punished for asking questions. It was, she had to admit, a coherent story. If you didn't know the facts, it was almost believable. She called Marsh. "He's filing against the Bureau," she said. "I know," Marsh said. "We saw it." Barrera wasn't at the podium. "No," Marsh said. "Barrera called us at 8 this morning. Pulled his support before the press conference." A pause. "He saw something last night that changed his calculation." Emily thought about that. "What did he see?" The water facility response, Marsh said. "He was at the coordination center at 4 a.m. came in to handle the traffic management escalation. He saw you working. He knew who you were. Caldwell had briefed him as part of the original inquiry, and he watched you coordinate medical reception for 20,000 displaced residents at 3 in the morning. Another pause. "He told me he called Caldwell at 6 a.m. and said he was withdrawing. Because of the response work," Emily said. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "I'm not standing next to a man who's attacking someone who just spent the night keeping this city's people safe." She sat with that. "That's not going to stop Caldwell's statement." "No," Marsh said, "but it does something else. Barrera is willing to give a statement to IA about Caldwell's conduct during the original inquiry. Things he saw that he didn't report." Emily went still. "What things?" the precinct briefing, Marsh said. "The one where Caldwell showed 14 officers the photograph of your wrist." Barrera was present. He saw the reaction in the room. He said Caldwell played it for laughs. She looked at the wall of her bedroom. The paint was a neutral off-white that she'd never bothered to change. "Played it for laughs," she said. "Yes." She breathed in slowly. "Okay," she said. "What does Forsyth need from me?" A silence. Brief. But she could hear the shape of what was in it. "Emily, she's been asking twice a day," Emily said. "And you said last night that minimum disclosure might not be enough anymore. Caldwell just put my name in front of cameras. He's going to keep going until someone stops him." She paused. "What does Forsyth need?" "She wants to make a statement," Marsh said carefully. "FEMA Regional, on record, confirming your background and your work history. Not the classified elements, just who you are, what you did, why the gaps exist, and the tattoo," Emily said. "Yes," Marsh said. "She wants to address what the tattoo is." Emily looked at her wrist, the rose. She'd looked at it so many times in the past 2 weeks that it had started to feel like something being watched rather than something worn. "Stop him? It will change what he's standing on," Marsh said. "Right now he's standing on a story about a suspicious woman with a hidden past. Forsyth makes that statement, the story changes. Standing on a story about a detective who harassed a decorated federal emergency specialist because he didn't like her tattoo." "True story," Emily said. "Yes," Marsh said. "The true story." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the architecture she'd built, quiet job, manageable life, no one knowing her name. She thought about how much of it had already come apart in 2 weeks, and whether what was left was worth the continued effort of holding it. Thought about Thomas Vance's letter. I hope it's something she would recognize. "Tell Forsyth yes," she said. "Tell her to make the statement." Director Forsyth's statement went out at 2 p.m. through official FEMA channels, which meant it hit the news wires within the hour. 3 paragraphs. The first confirmed Emily Carter's background as a former FEMA Special Operations emergency trauma specialist with 12 years of field service across 9 domestic and international disaster zones. The second confirmed that the gaps in her employment record were the result of classified operational deployments and standard federal personnel privacy protections. The third addressed the tattoo directly. It was a memorial covering surgical scars sustained during a 2019 operational deployment, in which Ms. Carter's actions directly resulted in the survival of 11 civilians. The tattoo was placed at her own request following the death of a colleague during the same operation. The statement did not mention Caldwell by name. It didn't need to. Emily read it once, sitting at her kitchen table, and put her phone face down on the table. The statement was accurate. Every word of it was accurate. That was the strange part, not that it was true, but that seeing it in print made it real in a way that the living of it hadn't always managed to. 12 years, 9 deployments, 11 civilians, 1 colleague. Nora. She turned her phone back over and texted Thomas Vance's number she'd held onto it from his letters filed in the back of a notebook she hadn't thrown away. She wrote, "I got your letter. Thank you for writing. I'm sorry it took me so long to respond to any of them." She looked at it for a moment, then added, "She was the best person I worked with. I don't say that lightly." She sent it before she could decide it was too much. Then she called Patricia. "Are you seeing the FEMA statement?" Patricia said when she answered. "I'm the FEMA statement," Emily said. A long silence. Then Patricia said with a quality in her voice that was very careful and very genuine. "Okay. I should have told you more," Emily said. "You told me what you needed to tell me," Patricia said. "You were a good nurse. You still are. That's what I know." Emily pressed her thumbnail against the table edge again. The old reflex. "I'll be in tomorrow," she said. "I know you will," Patricia said. Caldwell's attorney released a secondary statement at 4 p.m., which attempted to reframe the FEMA disclosure as confirmation that Emily had concealed material information from her employer and from the police during a legitimate inquiry. Competent piece of spin, not dishonest, exactly. More the kind of thing that was technically arguable if you squinted at it in bad light. It landed with the particular thud of a counter-narrative that arrives too late. By 4 p.m., the FEMA statement had been picked up by 7 news outlets. Dana Krell had written a follow-up piece that ran at 3:45, which connected the FEMA disclosure to the IA investigation, and noted, with the precise neutrality of someone who had decided exactly how much to say, the photograph Detective Caldwell had circulated was of surgical scarring sustained during a federal rescue operation. Comments on the original Callaway Tribune piece changed in real time. Emily didn't read them, she had a rule about that. Hard-learned, but Marsh texted her a summary. The public narrative has flipped. Statement is getting no traction. She was at the grocery store when she got that text, because she needed food and the world had a way of requiring mundane things, even when other things were happening. She was standing in the cereal aisle looking at options, and she read Marsh's text and put her phone back in her pocket and chose the same cereal she always bought. The IA process moved faster after Barrera's statement. Emily learned the shape of it gradually, not from official notifications, which she wasn't party to, but from Vasquez, who called twice over the following 3 days, with the specific professional courtesy of someone who was keeping a witness appropriately informed. Barrera had provided a detailed account of the precinct briefing. 2 of the officers who had been present had provided corroborating statements. The photograph issue, the question of consent, of how it was obtained and then circulated, had been formally documented. 3 of the 4 previously dismissed complaints against Caldwell had been reopened. One of them from a civilian woman who'd had her car searched on a traffic stop with no documented probable cause had new supporting evidence from a dashcam recording that the IA division had subpoenaed. He built a pattern over a long time, Vasquez told her on the 3rd day. Cases like this don't usually collapse because of one incident. They collapse because the incident that finally gets documented pulls the thread, and then everything attached to the thread comes with it. "What happens to him?" Emily said. "That's not determined yet," Vasquez said. "These processes take time." "I know they take time," Emily said. "I'm asking what the likely range is." A pause. Vasquez seemed to be deciding what she was permitted to say. "Suspension pending review is certain. Termination is possible. Criminal referral depends on what the search warrant piece turns up." She paused. "He's not going to be where he was before." Emily sat with that. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door closing on something that should have closed a long time ago, before it had the chance to damage the people it had damaged. "The 3 other complaints," she said. "The people who filed them, will they be contacted?" "They're already being contacted," Vasquez said. She was back in the trauma unit on a Tuesday 10 days after the water facility event, when Reuter called her directly. She didn't know how he'd gotten her number. She suspected Marsh, who had apparently decided that strategic helpfulness was a personality trait he was committed to. Reuter said the City Emergency Management Office was submitting a formal after-action report on the North Shore event. He said the report would reference her role in the medical coordination. He said he'd been in contact with the county health commissioner about a proposed restructuring of the city's mass casualty response framework, and that her name had come up. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're also someone with experience that the city could use," he said. "I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm telling you that when you're ready to have that conversation, there's a conversation to have." She thanked him and hung up and went back to her patient, who was a 70-year-old woman with a fractured hip and a lot of opinions about the pace of her own care. Emily adjusted the pace slightly, and the woman's opinions became more favorable, and they understood each other. This was also what the work looked like. This too. On Thursday, Forsyth's office sent her a formal communication. Not another call, a letter, which communicated a different register of seriousness. She read it at her kitchen table after her shift. Stills in her scrubs with the leftover coffee she'd reheated twice. It was an offer, formal, detailed, with terms she'd asked about and terms she hadn't expected. Consulting role with FEMA's Emergency Operations Coordination Division, part-time initially, structured to allow her to maintain her position at Harbor Ridge. Training development for regional mass casualty response. Occasional field deployment on request, not requirement. And at the bottom, a handwritten note in Forsyth's own script. She recognized it from the signature block. "This isn't the role you left. It doesn't have to be. What you do with it is up to you." Emily read the note twice. She thought about what Marsh had said. "I don't like leaving talent in places smaller than the talent." Thought about Reuter's call. She thought about the structural engineers on the North Shore, and the people who'd evacuated and the ones who hadn't, and the basin that held. She thought about Harbor Ridge, about Patricia Reese handing her coffee without ceremony, about the young officer with the wedding ring and his 8-month-old daughter, about Bernard Kowalczyk and his wife's name on his lips in the back of an ambulance. She didn't have to choose between them. That was what she kept coming back to. The offer didn't ask her to. She picked up a pen. She was going to write her response longhand, because some decisions deserved that. She'd written 2 sentences when her phone rang. Not Marsh, not Forsyth, not Patricia. The number was local, Harbor Ridge prefix. She didn't recognize it, she answered. "Miss Carter." Voice was male, low, careful. "My name is Gerald Ossie. I'm an attorney. I'm calling on behalf of Detective Ryan Caldwell." She set down her pen. "Detective Caldwell asked me to reach out to you directly," the attorney said. "He wanted me to convey that he has withdrawn his complaint against the FBI's involvement in the personnel matter." "I'm aware," she said. "He has also authorized me to inform you that he will not be contesting the internal affairs findings." A pause. "He wanted to express through me that he understands the findings are appropriate." Emily looked at the wall, the neutral off-white. "What does he want in exchange?" she said. A silence, longer than it should have been. "He's not asking for anything," Ossie said. "He asked me to tell you that he's not asking for anything." She waited. "He also asked me to give you a message," Ossie said. His voice had a quality in it now, not discomfort exactly, more the quality of a professional conveying something he hadn't expected to be asked to convey. He said, "I looked at one thing and told myself it was everything. I know what that cost you, I'm sorry." Emily was very still. "It's the message," Ossie said. "Okay," she said. "Is there anything you'd like me to communicate back?" Thought about it. She thought about the precinct room and the laughter and the photograph and the administrative meeting and 2 weeks of machinery in motion. She thought about what it cost a man like Caldwell to send an attorney to make a call like this one. "Tell him the process continues regardless," she said. "He knows that." "He does," Ossie said. "Tell him..." Reconsidered. "Tell him I heard him." She hung up. She sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and found the sentence she'd been writing. She was 3 words from finishing her response to Forsyth when her phone rang again. This time it was Marsh, and his voice had the quality she'd learned to identify over the past 2 weeks as the sound of someone who was working to keep something controlled that was trying not to be. "Emily," he said, "I need you to sit down." "I'm already sitting," she said. "Caldwell's attorney filed the consent paperwork for the IA proceedings at 4:30 today," he said. "Standard, we expected it." "But," she said, "but when the I office processed the filing, he said they found something attached to it. Something that wasn't supposed to be there." His voice was careful now. Careful. Caldwell submitted a supplemental disclosure as part of the consent filing. He disclosed evidence he had withheld during the original inquiry. Emily's hand stopped moving. "What kind of evidence?" "Dashcam footage," Marsh said, "from the night of the accident that brought the injured officers to Harbor Ridge in the first place. The footage was on a patrol car at the scene. Caldwell pulled it during the initial investigation and didn't log it." "What's on it?" she said. "Emily," he paused. "The original traffic accident, the one that started all of this. before any of the other events. The accident where officers Caldwell and Garza were injured. Another pause. Kind that meant what came next had weight. There was a third vehicle involved, one that left the scene. Caldwell identified the driver from the dashcam footage and didn't report it. She was very still. Why not? Because the driver was a city council member, Marsh said. A city council member who sits on the Public Safety Committee, who has oversight authority over the police department. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. Caldwell buried the footage because he was protecting someone. And that someone, Emily, that's why he was under internal review before you were ever in the picture. What the original inquiry was about. She looked at the 2 sentences she'd written in her letter to Forsyth. She looked at her wrist. He submitted it voluntarily, she said. The footage. As part of his consent filing, Marsh said. Yes. He knew what it would do. He knew exactly what it would do, Marsh said. To the council member. To himself. He submitted it anyway. Emily pressed her palm flat on the kitchen table. The tremor in her right hand was there. She let it be there. Who knows, she said. Right now? Mia, and Forsyth's office, which I briefed 20 minutes ago. A pause. And you, the council member, she said. This becomes a criminal matter. Almost certainly, Marsh said. Which means everything Caldwell did, the harassment, the photo, the briefing was happening, while he was sitting on evidence of a hit and run by a city official. She worked through it. He was protecting someone with power, and he was harassing someone without it. And the whole time, Marsh said quietly, he was the one buried in something he couldn't get out of. Emily looked at the ceiling. She'd spent 2 weeks being the subject of a narrative she hadn't written, and now the narrative was rewriting itself again. And this time it was bigger than her and bigger than Caldwell, and it reached into places that were going to take a long time to excavate. This goes public, she said, when I processes it. Yes, Marsh said. The council member. Yes. And Caldwell's original motive for the inquiry into me changes, she said. Not just a bad judgment call. He was under pressure. He was looking for something to trade. That's what it looks like, Marsh said. She sat with the full shape of it. The interconnection. The way one buried thing had pressed against everything above it until it all started to crack. She thought about the woman with the hit-and-run complaint she didn't know yet, if there was one, if anyone had reported the accident that night and been ignored. She thought about what Vasquez had said. Cases like this don't usually collapse because of one incident. They collapse because the incident that finally gets documented pulls the thread, and then everything attached to the thread comes with it. Marsh, she said. Yeah. The officers who were injured that night, Caldwell and Garza, do they know yet that the third driver was never pursued? A silence. No, Marsh said, they don't. She looked at her phone. She looked at the letter she'd been writing. She looked at the kitchen wall with its neutral paint and the window with the angled tree below, bent its persistent way in the dark. They're going to find out tomorrow, she said, that their accident was covered up by the man who spent the following 2 weeks trying to destroy a nurse's career. She said it flatly. Not dramatically, just as the fact it was. Marsh said. That's going to be a hard day, she said. It is, he said. Picked up her pen. She looked at the 2 sentences she'd written to Forsyth, and then she wrote the third one, and the fourth, and she finished the letter. She folded it along clean lines, slid it into an envelope, and left it on the table where she would see it in the morning before she could talk herself out of sending it. Then she made herself eat something toast, which was what she made when she didn't have the energy to decide anything more complex, and she went to bed at 9:30, like a person who had learned, imperfectly and over a long time. Some things could not be resolved by staying awake longer. She slept better than she had in 2 weeks. She didn't examine why. She just noted it and was grateful. Friday arrived with the particular quality of days that have been loading for a long time and finally tip. The IA office released a preliminary finding statement at 10 a.m. Emily was in the middle of a shift when Marsh texted her the summary, and she read it on her break in the supply corridor with the same fluorescent light overhead that she stood under every time she needed to be somewhere without anyone watching her face. The statement was 7 paragraphs. The first 5 addressed Caldwell's conduct across the 4 complaints that had been reopened, and the original inquiry into Emily. The language was administrative formal, drained of drama, which somehow made it worse. Words like improper disclosure of personnel information and discriminatory targeting based on physical characteristics and failure to follow evidentiary reporting protocol. Each phrase, corresponding to something that had happened to a real person, translated into the language institutions used when they were finally forced to acknowledge what they'd allowed. The 6th paragraph addressed the dashcam footage, confirmed the existence of the recording, confirmed that it had been withheld from reporting, and confirmed that the matter had been referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential obstruction charges. The seventh paragraph named the city council member. His name was Victor Aldrin, 47 years old, 3 terms on the city council, chair of the Public Safety Committee, which meant he had spent the last 4 years overseeing the police department that had, as apparent behest, buried evidence of his involvement in a hit-and-run accident. Emily didn't know him. She'd seen his name on public materials, the kind of background noise civic presence you accumulated just by living in a city, but she had no particular relationship to him. She read his name and thought about the 2 officers who had come into her ER that night with bruised ribs and a laceration and a blood pressure pattern she'd caught because she caught everything. She thought about how that night had started all of this. She thought about how long a buried thing could stay buried before the ground. Above it started to show the shape of what was underneath. Put her phone away and went back to her patients. By noon, it was on every local news outlet. She knew this because 3 different people at the hospital told her not maliciously, just the way people shared information they thought was relevant, and because Dana Krell texted her a link to the Tribune piece with no message attached, which was its own kind of communication. Emily looked at the link and didn't click it. She could read it later. Right now there was a shift to finish. Patricia found her at 2 o'clock, with a look that was making an effort to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Falk wants to talk to you, she said, when you have a break. Tell him 4 o'clock, Emily said. She finished her charting first. She did it deliberately, because the work was the work, and it didn't move around other people's schedules, and because doing it first was a way of reminding herself what she was actually here for. Falk's office was on the 4th floor, the same floor as the conference room where, 3 weeks ago, he had told her she was being reassigned from the trauma unit because a detective had shown up with a photograph. He was standing when she came in, which she read correctly as a man who had decided this conversation required physical effort. Please sit, he said. She sat. He sat. I've been watching what's been in the news, he said, and reading the IA statement. He put both hands on the desk in front of him. I made a mistake when Caldwell came in. I want to say that clearly. Okay, she said. I let institutional caution override what should have been my instinct, which was that you were an excellent nurse with a clean record, and there was no legitimate basis for what he was asking. He said it with the quality of someone who had rehearsed it but meant it. The 2 things were not mutually exclusive. I'm sorry for that. I know, she said. The board has been briefed. They've asked me to convey that the hospital fully supports your reinstatement, which you're already aware of, and that we'd like to discuss an expanded role. He paused. Given what's come out about your background, the FEMA work, the field experience, we'd like to talk about developing a mass casualty response protocol for the hospital. Formally, with you leading it. Emily looked at him. He was sincere. He was also, she noted, a man who was now offering her something that was good for the hospital and good for her simultaneously, which was not the same as it only being good for her. She didn't hold that against him. That was just how institutions worked when they worked at all. I've been in contact with FEMA's regional office, she said, and the City Emergency Management Office. There may be a framework where all of those conversations happen together. Falk nodded slowly. That sounds like a better solution than what we'd have come up with on our own, he said. It is, she said, not unkindly, just accurately. He almost smiled. I'll have whoever needs to be on that call reach out to you. He stood. They shook hands, and the handshake was the thing it was supposed to be, neither cold nor overfamiliar. Just 2 people who had found their way to a working understanding after not having one. She was at the door when he said, Emily. She looked back. The nurses who were on shift, when this started, they never doubted you. He said it carefully, like he'd been holding it and wanted to set it down. Right. I want you to know that. She thought about Patricia answering the phone at 2 in the morning without hesitation. I know, she said. I never doubted that either. The thing about a public reckoning was that it didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in accumulation, in the way that pressure had built gradually, and then all at once, with the sensation of things finally moving that had been stuck for too long. Dr. Aldrin resigned from the city council on Monday morning, 4 days after the IA statement. His resignation letter cited a desire to spend more time with his family, which was the language of someone who had been told the alternative language would be worse. The district attorney's office confirmed they were reviewing the matter. No charges had been filed yet. Emily understood from Marsh that Yet was doing significant work in that sentence. Caldwell was formally suspended with pay pending the completion of the IA review. Suspended with pay was the institutional version of being held in a waiting room uncomfortable, not permanent, the outcome still to be determined. His attorney released no further public statements after Monday. PR firm's contract appeared to have concluded. The union rep put out a single sentence acknowledging the seriousness of the findings and saying nothing further. People Emily actually thought about the civilians behind the 3 reopened complaints were harder to track. She didn't know their names. She didn't have a right to their stories. She hoped the process gave them something real. She knew processes didn't always do that, which was different from being able to make them. Officers Kolowski and Garza were notified on Friday morning about the dashcam footage. She heard about this secondhand through Marsh, who'd been briefed by Barrera. Kolowski apparently had needed a moment alone after being told. Garza had asked 3 times whether they were sure, whether the footage was clear, whether there was any ambiguity in the identification. There wasn't. Emily thought about Kolowski and her ER on the night it started, looking at her wrist with that calculating look. She didn't feel vindicated by what had happened to him exactly. He hadn't done what Caldwell had done. He'd just looked at her wrist and said something careless, which was ordinary human thoughtlessness rather than the deliberate campaign that followed. But she thought about him sitting somewhere on Friday morning, being told that the accident that had hurt him, that had started everything, had been covered up by someone with power who decided his safety was worth less than their protection, and she found she had something close to sympathy for him. Not for what he'd said, for what he'd been part of without knowing it. She mailed Forsyth's letter on Saturday morning. Post office was 2 blocks from the Brennan Arms. She dropped it in the blue box outside and stood in the October light for a moment before walking back. The letter confirmed her acceptance of the consulting role. It included 3 conditions she'd added in the margins before sealing it, because she was not a person who accepted things without conditions, that her clinical work at Harbor Ridge remained primary and protected, that field deployment requests required 30 days' notice except in declared federal emergencies, and that the training curriculum she'd be developing for mass casualty coordination would be made available at no licensing cost to underfunded regional emergency services. Forsyth called her that afternoon to confirm receipt. She didn't mention the conditions as unusual. She said simply, "These are reasonable. Done," which told Emily something about Forsyth's decision-making style that she filed away as useful. "There'll be a formal announcement from the regional office," Forsyth said. "We'd like to include a brief statement from you. You can write it yourself." "Keep it short," Emily said. "Short is fine," Forsyth said. "Short and true is better than long and impressive." Emily thought she was going to like working with Forsyth. Thomas Vance wrote back on Sunday. His text was longer than she expected he was. It turned out, a person who wrote the way his sister had talked, which was directly and without much decoration. He said he was glad she'd reached out. He said he'd been following the news, which meant he'd seen at least some of what had happened. He said, "Nora always said the hardest thing about working with you was that you were better at saving everyone else than you were at letting anyone save you." He added. She meant it as a compliment mostly. Emily read that twice. She wrote back. She was usually right about things. "Part of what made losing her so difficult," he replied. "She'd want you to stop using her as a reason to stay small. I think you probably know that." She stared at the text for a long time. Then she wrote, "Yeah, I'm working on it." He sent back a single word, "Good." Put her phone in her pocket and went for a run. The October air was sharp and clear, and the city looked like itself, not the emergency version, not the 2 a.m. version, just the ordinary daytime city that kept existing regardless of what happened inside it. She ran her usual route, past the coffee shop on Heller Street, past the park with the broken fountain, past the elementary school with the leaves collecting against the fence. She ran until the tremor in her right hand stopped, and her lungs were doing the thing that was just pure function, nothing extra, and she thought about very little except the next block and the one after that. The formal public statement from the Harbor Ridge Police Department came on Wednesday of the following week. Emily was notified in advance by Vasquez, who called her Tuesday evening with the specific professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout. "Department is issuing a public apology," Vasquez said. "Commissioner's office. Formal statement. Press release. You'll see it tomorrow morning. I wanted you to hear it from me first." "Okay," Emily said. "It names you directly," Vasquez said. "Acknowledges that the inquiry was conducted improperly, that the dissemination of your photograph was unauthorized and harmful, and that the department failed in its obligations to you as a private citizen." A pause. "It also acknowledges the inappropriate environment created in the precinct briefing. That one took some internal negotiation to get in there." "But it's in there," Emily said. "It's in there," Vasquez confirmed. "What about Caldwell? The statement doesn't name him. Ongoing personnel matter. But it's clear enough." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Emily, the commissioner asked me to pass on something personally. He asked me to tell you that he reviewed the full IA record himself, and that he was his word ashamed. Emily sat with that. That's a significant word for a commissioner to use. It is, Vasquez said. I thought you should hear it accurately. After she hung up, Emily sat in her apartment for a while without doing much. She'd been preparing herself in a low-level ongoing way for something to feel different when the formal apology came. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, relief maybe, or the clean sensation of something closed. What she actually felt was more complicated and less satisfying than either. She felt tired in a specific way, and she felt something that was almost grief but wasn't quite, for the time and the energy and the particular toll of 2 weeks of machinery, all because a man had photographed her wrist without asking. She also felt underneath those things something that was quieter and harder to name. Something that had to do with being correctly seen. Celebrated not yet, but seen, the record corrected. Story told in the right direction. It wasn't everything. It was something real. The press conference happened on Thursday morning. Emily didn't attend. She was working a shift, and the shift was where she was supposed to be. And she'd decided sometime in the middle of the previous week that she was not going to organize her life around the administrative resolution of something that should never have started. The resolution was correct. It was also just paperwork. It didn't change what she'd done or who she was. She watched a 2-minute clip on her phone during her lunch break, standing in the break room with her food getting cold next to her. Commissioner, a gray-haired man she'd seen in photographs, but never in person, read the statement in the measured tones of institutional contrition. A reporter asked whether the department would be implementing new protocols regarding civilian inquiries. Commissioner said yes. Another reporter asked about Caldwell specifically and was told the personnel matter was ongoing. A third reporter, she recognized Dana Krell's voice before she saw her, asked, "What message does the department want to send to civilians who are treated the way Ms. Carter was treated?" The commissioner paused. He seemed to be deciding between the prepared answer and the real one. He went with something that was close to both. That we got it wrong, he said, and that we owe it to the people we serve to understand how we got it wrong so it doesn't happen again. It wasn't a satisfying answer. It was an honest one, which was rarer and, on reflection, more useful. Emily closed the clip and ate her lunch. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the weather had finally committed to actual autumn, she walked into a conference room on the 9th floor of the federal building on Aldermore Street for her first formal meeting in her new role. Forsyth was there in person. Emily hadn't expected that, had assumed the regional director would join by video from wherever regional directors actually were. But Forsyth was compact and silver-haired, and had the kind of handshake that communicated she'd been shaking hands in rooms like this for 25 years, and had made her peace with it. She was accompanied by 2 members of her staff, and a representative from the City Emergency Management Office, which turned out to be Reuter, who nodded at Emily across the table with the expression of a man who had already updated his assessment and was now simply proceeding. Marsh was there. He sat to Emily's left and contributed to the meeting in the specific way of someone who had facilitated the process of getting everyone into the room and was now content to let the room do its work. They spent 2 hours building the framework for what the mass casualty coordination protocol would look like, not the detail, which would take months and multiple working sessions, but the architecture. Who held authority at different phases of a response? How medical coordination integrated with fire and law enforcement commands? What the training curriculum would cover and who it would reach? Emily had come prepared with a 14-page document she'd drafted over the previous 2 weeks in the early mornings before her shifts, and she walked the room through it with the focused clarity of someone who had been thinking about these problems for a long time and was finally in a room with the people who could help solve them. Forsyth asked 2 questions during the entire presentation. Both were excellent. Emily answered them directly and without hedging, and Forsyth nodded and wrote something in her notebook and moved on. Afterward, when the staff members were collecting their materials and Reuter was on his phone with something from his office, Forsyth came to stand beside her at the window. The view was the same as it had been on Emily's first visit, the side of the other building, the horizontal crack near the top. "Thought about this for a long time," Forsyth said. "Question. Some of it," Emily said. "Some of it came from what happened at the interchange." "Interchange showed you what the gaps looked like in real time," Forsyth said. "Thinking was already there." Emily considered that. "Suppose it was." Forsyth looked at the building across the way for a moment. "I've been in this work for a long time," she said. "People who are genuinely good at it, the field coordination, the mass casualty management, the part that requires staying functional when everything is breaking, they tend to share one characteristic. She paused. They've been through something. Not in the motivational sense. I mean, they've actually been through something, and they came out the other side still choosing to show up. That's not common. Emily said nothing. I know what happened in Kaswan province, Forsyth said. I was briefed on it when your name came up. I know what you've been carrying. She turned to look at Emily directly. I also know that the 11 people who survived that mission are alive because of the decisions you made in the worst hours of your life. She said it the way Vasquez had said things, not for effect, not to be kind, but because it was precisely accurate and she'd decided Emily was owed precision. The record. That's what actually happened. Emily looked at the crack in the building across the way. I know what happened, she said. I was there. I know you know, Forsyth said. I'm saying it anyway because knowing something and letting yourself believe it are different operations. She picked up her notebook. 14 pages, she said. First meeting. The framework is solid. She moved toward the door. See you in 2 weeks. The room emptied. Emily stood at the window alone for a moment. She looked at the crack. It ran from left to right across the concrete face of the building at a slight angle. Hairline. The kind of structural evidence that buildings accumulated over time, not failure. Just the record of stress absorbed and held. She'd looked at it before and thought of it as damage. She looked at it now and thought of it as something else, the shape of what the structure had survived. Picked up her 14-page document and put it in her bag and took the elevator down. The official statement from FEMA's regional office ran the following day. It was short, as she'd promised 4 sentences confirming her role, describing her background in general terms, and noting the new coordination framework being developed in partnership with the city. The last sentence was hers, written in her own words, revised twice and left imperfect because the perfectly polished version felt like someone else. Spent a long time believing that the most useful thing I could do was stay quiet and stay small. I understand now that that was a choice I made out of grief, and that grief, held long enough without air, starts to look like wisdom. It isn't. The work continues. Marsh texted her when it went out. Good statement. She wrote back. It's 4 sentences. He wrote, sometimes that's enough. On a Friday afternoon in November, Emily walked into a room she'd never been in before, a training space in the hospital's education wing, recently allocated for the mass casualty response curriculum she was developing. It smelled like new carpet and had too many chairs, which was a problem for later. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the whiteboard on the far wall, blank and enormous, and felt the particular specific sensation of a space that was waiting to be used. She uncapped a marker. She wrote 3 things on the board, because a curriculum needed to start somewhere. What do we know? What do we have? What do we do next? She'd been asked those questions in her first field deployment, years ago, by a team leader who'd since retired to somewhere in the mountains. He'd asked them in the middle of a disaster scene, with no functioning communications and 6 casualties and a rain that wouldn't stop. And he'd ask them not because he didn't know the answers, but because he wanted everyone in the team to understand that those 3 questions were the entire operational framework, that everything else was detail built on that foundation. She'd used those questions ever since. She used them in her own head, making decisions. She'd used them at the interchange, at the water facility, in every emergency that had come through her bay. They were the most useful thing anyone had ever taught her. Stepped back and looked at what she'd written. The door opened behind her. She turned. It was Patricia Reese, standing in the doorway, with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had found the right room on the first try. Heard you were setting up, she said. Figured you'd forget to eat or drink anything for 6 hours. I've been here for 3 minutes, Emily said. I know your 3 minutes, Patricia said. She came in and set one of the coffees on the edge of the nearest table and looked at the board. Is that the curriculum? That's the starting point, Emily said. 3 questions, Patricia said. Everything else comes from those. Patricia looked at the board for a moment. Who taught you that? Someone who understood that panic is just the absence of a framework, Emily said. Give people a framework. They can function in almost anything. Is that what this is? Patricia said. A framework? Emily looked around the room, the blank board, the too many chairs, the new carpet smell. That's what we're building, she said. She picked up her coffee. It was the right temperature, which meant Patricia had timed this perfectly, which was exactly the kind of thing Patricia did without ever mentioning it. Emily had noticed it dozens of times and never said anything, and now she said, thank you, for the coffee and for the 20 other things you do that I don't acknowledge. Patricia looked at her with mild surprise. You're acknowledging them now, she said. Practicing, Emily said. Patricia smiled, the real one, not the professional one. Terrible at it. she said. I know, Emily said. I'm getting better. The last time she saw Ryan Caldwell was not arranged. It happened the way the whole thing had started incidentally, in a hospital hallway, when she was on her way somewhere else, and he was too. He was in civilian clothes, walking out of the elevator she was walking toward. Stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. The hallway was empty enough that there was no pretending otherwise. He looked worse than the last time she'd seen him, not dramatically, but in the way of someone who had been living with consequences, and the consequences had weight. There were circles under his eyes and something diminished in his posture that had nothing to do with physical health. Miss Carter, he said. Detective, she said, then stopped herself. I don't know if that's still the correct title. It's not, he said. Currently. She nodded. Neither of them moved toward the elevator or away from it. The hallway held them in the particular suspended quality of an encounter that hasn't decided what it is yet. Are you here about the Aldrin matter? She said. The district attorney's investigation had been proceeding for 3 weeks. She didn't know his specific role in it. Cooperating witness, he said. The words came out flat. Not ashamed exactly, past shame, into the territory where a person has already made the decision and is simply living inside it. I'm giving them everything. I know, she said. Marsh had told her. I know you know, he said. They stood there for a moment longer. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been trained to look at patients when she needed to understand what was actually happening, rather than what was presenting. He was a man who had made a series of decisions, each one building on the last, and had arrived at a place he hadn't intended and couldn't walk backward from. She'd seen that trajectory before. She'd seen it end different ways. What happens to you, she said, not pointed, genuinely asking. I don't know yet, he said. The DA is I don't know what I'm getting from cooperating. My attorney says it helps. He paused. The IA findings are final. I'm out. That's already done. She didn't say anything to that. I wanted to say something to you, he said. Not through my attorney. In person. He seemed to be searching for the right configuration of words and not fully finding it. I'm not going to tell you I was having a bad year or that there was pressure. That's all true, and it's not your problem. He stopped. Started again. I looked at you, and I made a decision about who you were before I knew anything. And then I built a case around that decision, instead of letting the evidence lead anywhere. He looked at her steadily. That's the worst thing a cop can do. I knew that when I was doing it. I did it anyway. I'm sorry, he said. That's all. I know what it doesn't do. I just wanted to say it to your face. She looked at him for a moment. The thing that she'd felt when O.C. had called her, the complicated response to a genuine apology from someone who had genuinely harmed her, was here in person now, and it was no less complicated for being face-to-face. I heard what you said to O.C., she said, about looking at one thing and calling it everything. Yeah, he said. That's the part I want you to carry, she said. Not just the professional consequence. That part. The habit of deciding before knowing. She paused. Because I'm not the only person you did that to. His jaw tightened, not defensively, with a particular tension of someone absorbing something true. I know, he said. The 3 other complaints, she said. I know, he said again. She nodded. There wasn't much else. The conversation had reached its correct end, not resolution, not reconciliation, but the honest acknowledgement of what had happened between 2 people who had not chosen to know each other and who had arrived at a real and difficult truth together. That was what was available. She didn't need it to be more. Press the elevator button. It arrived promptly, which happened rarely enough that she noticed. I hope the cooperation helps you, she said, stepping in. Not for your sake specifically, for what you know about Aldrin. The doors closed before he could respond. She rode up alone and stood very straight and felt the elevator move and thought, that's done. Not everything. Not the process. Not the other 3 people who still had their own reckonings to navigate. But that specific thing between her and him, standing in a hallway with nobody watching, that was done. December came in cold and fast. The training curriculum had its first pilot session on a Thursday, with 12 participants, a mix of Harbor Ridge nurses, paramedics from 2 EMS providers, and 2 firefighters who Doss had sent with the endorsement that they were his sharpest people. Emily taught the first module herself. She wasn't a natural teacher in the performance sense. She didn't have the instinct for drama that made content feel exciting from the outside. What she had was precision and genuine investment in whether people actually understood what she was telling them, and those turned out to be more useful. At the end of the 3-hour session, she opened the floor for questions. The first one came from one of the firefighters, a young woman named Akers, who had been the most skeptical presence in the room for the first hour and the most engaged for the second 2. The 3 questions, Akers said, What do we know? What do we have? What do we do next? At what point in a scene do you ask them? Continuously, Emily said. Every few minutes? Every time the situation changes, Emily said. Constantly. The framework isn't a checklist you complete and set aside. It's a loop. The scene gives you new information. You update your assessment, you update your plan. She looked at the room. The mistake people make is treating their initial assessment as fixed. It's not. It's just the first iteration. Akers wrote something down. Paramedic beside her was nodding. What if your second assessment contradicts your first? Someone asked from the back. Then your second assessment is better informed, Emily said. Update it. Don't defend the first one just because you made it. She watched that land in the room, the way it moved across faces at different speeds, the ones for whom it was obvious, and the ones for whom it was new, and the ones for whom it had the quality of being told something they already knew, but had never heard said directly. She'd sat in that last category herself once, on a hillside in a country she wasn't supposed to be in, being told about roses growing through cracked stone. On the last day of the year, she went to visit Garrett Yoon. Not to the hospital he'd been discharged 6 weeks earlier. He was home, apparently doing well, back to light duty by the new year by his own plan. His wife had sent a note to the hospital addressed simply to the nurse at the scene, which had taken 2 weeks to find its way to Emily, who had been both known and unknown in the time between. Called the number in the note first. The wife, her name was Jessie, answered and said yes, they'd like that, and gave her an address in the North Shore residential district, not far from where the water treatment facility stood restored and reinforced on the shore. She brought nothing. She'd thought about bringing something and couldn't decide what was right, so she arrived with just herself, which felt awkward for approximately the first 30 seconds, and then felt correct. Garrett Yoon opened the door. He looked better than the last time she'd seen him, color in his face, the careful way of moving that came with healing ribs mostly gone. He looked at her the way the people she saved sometimes looked at her, and she had never gotten fully comfortable with it, and she'd accepted that she never would. I didn't know how to find you, he said, for a while. I wasn't making it easy, she said. He laughed. It was a real one. Come in, he said. Jessie was in the kitchen with the baby Mara, 8 months now, at the stage where everything was fascinating and nothing was safe. Emily sat on the couch and looked at the baby with the particular attention of someone who didn't spend much time around babies and found them simultaneously more and less manageable than most emergency situations. She's okay, Jessie said, reading something in Emily's expression. You can hold her if you want. I'm fine, Emily said. You look like you're assessing her for trauma, Garrett said. Occupational habit, Emily said. He smiled. They talked for an hour, not about the accident, not much. Mostly about the ordinary things that people talked about when they were finding out whether they were going to know each other. He'd grown up in the city. She'd grown up in 4 different cities, which was its own answer to its own question. He liked to fish, which surprised her slightly. She ran, which surprised him not at all. When she stood to leave, Jessie put Mara in Garrett's arms and walked Emily to the door. In the small entrance hallway, with her coat on and the cold air coming from outside, Jessie stopped and looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had been waiting to say something and had chosen her moment. I need to tell you something, Jessie said. About that night. Emily waited. I was at the hospital when they brought him in, Jessie said. I got there about 40 minutes after they called me. And the nurse at the desk, not you, someone else, she told me he was in trauma and stable. She paused. She said that a nurse had found him at the scene and done something with the way they cut the car that made the difference. She stopped again. Her eyes had gone bright. She said if they'd cut it the other way, the angle would have... It's okay, Emily said. I know, Jessie said. That's what I wanted to tell you. That I know. And that Mara is going to know. Emily looked at her. This young woman who had spent a night in a hospital waiting room not knowing, and then had spent the weeks after that with a particular complicated gift of a life that almost wasn't. Tell her whatever she needs to know, Emily said. Don't make it too large. She'll find out for herself that the world has people in it who show up. It's enough. Jessie nodded. She seemed to be holding the words carefully. Emily shook her hand and went out into the cold. She drove home the long way, past the interchange, which had been rebuilt, new concrete, new barriers, a different configuration that the city engineers believed was safer. She drove past slowly and looked at it, which she hadn't done since the night itself. It looked like a highway. It looked like what it was supposed to be. She drove past the water treatment facility on the North Shore. The lights were seen inside, the facility running its quiet, necessary work, the repaired containment structures, holding the way structures hold when they've been given the attention they need. She drove through the city as it moved into the last hours of the year, restaurants full, groups of people in coats on sidewalks, the ambient noise of a place that continued being itself through everything it survived. Parked outside the Brennan Arms and sat in the car for a moment. She thought about the person she'd been when she moved into this building, careful, contained, deliberately small. She hadn't been wrong to need that for the time she'd needed it. Grief required a container, and she'd built one, and she'd lived in it, and there was nothing shameful about that. But she wasn't the same person she'd been then. That was the thing about carrying something for long enough. Eventually you learned the shape of it. Eventually the weight became familiar rather than crushing. Eventually you could set it down not because it was gone, but because you'd stopped needing to hold it away from you. She looked at her wrist. The rose in the dark, ink over damage, art over the evidence of what she'd survived. Roses don't grow where nothing hurts. She thought about Nora, who had been dead for 4 years and was still, somehow, the person whose opinion she consulted most. She thought about what Thomas had written. She'd want you to stop using her as a reason to stay small. She got out of the car. She walked up to her apartment. She stood in the kitchen, the table, the 2 sentences written, and then the rest of them, the window, with the angled tree below, and she felt the particular quality of a space that was starting to fit her differently. Not because it had changed. Because she had. She made tea. She sat at the table. She didn't read anything, or look at her phone, or think about anything in particular that needed resolving. She sat in the quiet of the last night of the year and let it be quiet, which was its own kind of work for her, and she did it anyway. There was no single moment when everything became what it was supposed to be. There was just the accumulation of ordinary days in which she showed up, did the work, taught what she knew, learned what she didn't, and allowed herself to be known by the people who had earned that. The curriculum grew. The coordination framework became real tested in 2 smaller events the following spring, adjusted, improved, tested again. Reuter started calling her before emergencies rather than during them, which was progress of the practical kind. Harbor Ridge's trauma unit ran the way a good trauma unit ran, imperfectly, under pressure, with people who were tired and skilled and committed in varying combinations on varying days. Emily had a patient who reminded her of Nora, once the dark humor, the quick processing, the way she managed her own pain by making other people's easier, and she had to take a breath in a supply corridor and give herself 30 seconds, which she did, and then she went back in. She called Thomas Vance in March. They talked for an hour about Nora and about other things, and about the specific strange territory of people who had been connected by grief and were finding out whether there was anything beyond it. There was. That was what she found out on that call. There was something beyond it that was not the same as what had been before, but was real and present, and hers if she was willing to take it. She was willing. The tremor in her right hand never fully resolved. She'd stopped expecting it to. It came under stress and sometimes under stillness, and she'd learned to work around it and sometimes through it, and to let it be what it was, not a malfunction, just the body's record of what it had been through. Couldn't fix it. She didn't hide it anymore. In April, she trained the first cohort of what became the Harbor Ridge Mass Casualty Response Team 14 nurses, paramedics, and first responders who went through the full curriculum over 6 weeks and came out the other side with the 3 questions and everything built on them. She watched them in their practical sessions and saw the thing happen that she'd hoped for, the moment when a framework that had been external became internal. When the 3 questions stopped being something they'd been taught and became something they thought with. That was the thing she understood. That was what all of it had actually been about, not her story, not the vindication, not the record corrected, and the apology issued, and the machinery run to its conclusion. Those things had happened, and they had mattered. But underneath them, the actual thing, the one that persisted, people in the middle of disasters who knew what to do, people who showed up and functioned and brought other people through. That was what Nora had done. That was what Emily had done on the hillside and at the interchange and on the North Shore in the rain. That was what these 14 people were going to do, in the emergencies that were coming for them that she couldn't predict, and they couldn't either. She stood at the whiteboard on the last day of the cohort and looked at those 3 questions which had been on the board since November and had not been erased. What do we know? What do we have? What do we do next? Take these with you, she said to the room. Not just for the field. Questions work anywhere. Every hard situation you're ever going to face. What do you know? What do you have? What do you do next? In that order. It forces you to be honest about your actual resources instead of your ideal ones. Keeps you in the present instead of the disaster you're afraid might come. She paused. Keeps you moving, which is the most important thing. Not moving fast, not moving perfectly, just moving. Because the worst thing you can do in an emergency is stop. She looked at them. "You're ready," she said. She meant it. She said things she meant, or she didn't say them, and she meant this. The nurse they had underestimated, the quiet one with the tattoo, the one they'd photographed and mocked and questioned and tried to make small, had spent her whole life being more prepared for the worst than anyone around her knew. And the worst had come, in the form of a highway and a rainstorm, and a man with a phone camera and a precinct full of laughter, and she had not been broken by it. She had been, in the end, exactly who she'd always been. She just finally had the room to let people see it. Her scars were not proof of weakness. They never had been. They were proof that she had gone through something real and come out the other side, still choosing to show up, which was she had finally learned to believe exactly enough.